This happened in the summer, and I believe I was about 12 at the time. I was staying in a hotel in a fairly large city with my mom and my younger brother. We were visiting other extended family, but chose not to stay in their house. My brother is younger than me by a decent amount, so I was usually told to keep an eye on him. On the day we arrived, my mom told me to do just that while she checked us in and received our room card. So, my brother and I sat down on a couch in the lobby and relaxed a little bit. While we were sitting, a man in about his mid-40s walked into the hotel. The couch was facing the hotel doors, so I got a good look at him. I remember that he was very average looking. Describing his features in detail could generate several different images. The guy comes in and sits on the couch opposite ours. I didn't think anything of it until I realized that he didn't go up to the counter first. He just came in and sat down. It made me feel a little uncomfortable. Maybe I was being a bit paranoid, but I thought he might have followed us in. Thankfully, my mom called us over and told us that our room was ready. We left the lobby and went to our room. Shortly afterwards, we left the hotel to go meet family. I forgot about the man for the rest of the day. We returned at about 7, and my mom told us that we could go swimming in the hotel pool. We all went to our room, changed, and went to the pool. A few minutes after we got into the water, the same man from before walked in and sat down. He was wearing jeans and a sweater, so he definitely wasn't going swimming. Again, we didn't think much of it until I could see that my mom was visibly worried. She pointed him out to me, and she said that if he didn't leave within 5 minutes, we needed to go back to our rooms. 5 minutes passed and he was still there, so we got our things and left. By then, it was close to 8 o'clock. We had brought a rented movie to watch, so we planned to watch that and go straight to bed. I noticed that my mom was a little on edge because of the man who had been watching us, and I got a little more worried myself too. Halfway through the movie, my mom got up to get into the shower. While she was in there, someone knocked on the door and said, "Housekeeping." I thought it was weird that the cleaning staff would come this late, but we needed another towel, so I answered the door. I wish I hadn't been so stupid. It was the same creepy man. He gave me a smile and a little wave. I just stood there, kind of motionless. My mind automatically went to the worst possible situation: kidnapping, rape, torture, etc. I heard the water in the shower turn off. He stood there as well for a moment, and then he spoke. "How was your swim?" At that moment, my mom came out of the shower, saw the man at the door, pulled me back, and slammed the door. She locked it. Then she called the front desk from our hotel phone to report the guy. I told her to just call the police, but she didn't listen. She then requested we switch rooms. I then heard footsteps stomping down the hallway away from our room. Thankfully, the guy had left. After that, we switched hotel rooms and didn't see the guy again during our stay. Have you ever gotten an uneasy feeling staying in a hotel room, especially by yourself? Likely not, and I also doubt you've ever been in a hotel room by yourself. But when I was a kid, I always got scared sleeping in hotel rooms. I would always keep looking back at the dark corners of the room every 20 seconds, thinking there would be somebody standing there. My fear not only drove me crazy, it drove my parents crazy, as I would always insist that I would sleep between them until I was around 9 or 10 years old. Anyway, eventually I had to grow up, or at least give off the impression, and started sleeping in my own bed or sharing the bed with my sister. Now I'm 24 years old, living on my own, and have to take a lot of business-related trips for my job. On one particular out-of-town trip, I was staying at a Comfort Inn in North Carolina, with all the expenses paid by my job, of course. I was in the area for a meeting with an office in a different town, and the inn was my home for the night. It was across the street from some big car dealership. That's all I remember about the surroundings. Anyway, I was off the next day, so I could look forward to just relaxing in the hotel and watching a couple movies. I was ironically watching the first Saw movie, and I swear, during the scene where Adam was hearing sounds in his apartment, my childhood paranoia started to come back for a bit, as I thought I heard little crackling type noises coming from inside the closet. Being 24, I told myself that I had to get over this nonsensical childish fear. I simply raised the volume on the movie and tried to ignore it. At the same time, I popped 2 sleeping pills into my mouth so that I'd be wiped out by the time the movie was over. Eventually, I flipped off the TV and rolled over onto my side to finally get some shut-eye. That was when the crackling noises became apparent again. It wasn't constant or anything. It was just like once every minute or so I'd hear this crackling type noise that I just can't describe coming from the closet. It wasn't happening too frequently to really bother me, and the sleeping pills were knocking me out at that point, so I was out within like 10 minutes. The next thing I remember, I woke to the sound of cloth being rustled around. I sprang to an upright position, but it was literally too dark to even see within a few feet in front of me. After I flipped on the bedside light, there I saw somebody dressed in all black with a hood over his head, probably 6'5", 250 pounds, rummaging through my bag. I screamed at the top of my lungs, and in response, he fled the room. He had stolen my wallet and my watch, but he had also created a lasting memory that only digs deeper into a very large childhood fear of mine. I have never heard a story about anything like this on the news or anything, so for something like this to happen to a person like me, somebody who had such an odd, specific fear as a child, was simply catastrophic to me. When I was 17, I started to develop some beef with my dad, who's a huge hothead. Tensions would grow worse through the years, and it got to the point that I would commonly have to leave for the night after getting into huge fights with my dad about personal things that I won't talk about. Sometimes I would stay at a friend's house or check into a hotel. It was May 9th, 2015. I was 21 years old, and after another huge scene back at home with my dad, I had to get out of there for my own good. I checked into a nearby hotel, the Quality Inn and Suites. It was literally half a mile from my house. I'd be throwing away a little less than $100 for it, but I had nowhere else to go. It was early this time around. Usually these outbursts happen around nighttime. It was like 4 o'clock, so I decided to just hang out by the outdoor pool and clear my head. It was funny, I was the only one around in this hotel. The pool was empty, the hallways were empty, even the lobby was empty, except for, of course, the desk worker. Then again, it was only May, and it wasn't like we lived in some huge vacation destination of a town. My room was in the middle of the hall on the 2nd floor. I had no idea why they'd given me that room, since it seemed like I was one of the only few people staying in the hotel. I hung out in my room after the pool for a bit. That's when there was a very light tapping on the door. I waited for someone to yell housekeeping, but they never did. Therefore, I ignored it. And to my surprise, even though I had the do not disturb sign on the door handle, I heard the beep of the lock on the door, and then I heard the door slowly opening. I called out, no thank you, not right now. I couldn't see the employee at the door because there was a wall that blocked the view of the door from the bed. There was a pause, and I repeated myself, growing a bit curious. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. It actually startled me. I got up to actually go follow them and tell them that that was rude. When I stepped into the hall, I looked to my right. Nobody. I looked to my left, and at the end of the hall, I saw the right leg of a woman turning the left corner further down the hall before disappearing. How did she get there so fast, I wondered. I ran down to the end of the hall, and that's when I heard another door closing. When I turned the corner, nobody. Just maybe 20 closed, unoccupied hotel doors. I was so confused and honestly a bit freaked out. I went down to the front desk to complain about the rude employee. The woman at the counter said that must be Rosa. She said she would question her about slamming the door later on. I thanked the woman and then went out to eat at the nearby TGI Fridays down the road. When I got back to the room, I was on the phone talking to my mom, who said that I shouldn't come back because my dad was still super pissed. I entered my room and told her how depressed I was with all this fighting bullshit, and she understood. When I hung up, it was only 8 o'clock. I wanted the night to be over. I brushed my teeth, watched a little TV, and went to sleep at around 9 o'clock. I awoke to a noise. At first, I didn't know what it was. I rubbed my eyes, sat up, and listened.
You have to let them in.
There was somebody standing at the left edge of my bed, towering over me. I screamed and felt like throwing up at the same time. It was a dreadful, horrifying feeling. The person then grabbed around my throat and started repeating the words, "You piece of shit." It was an older woman with a weak grip. I was able to escape easily. I ran to the door of the room. I heard her following me, but she stopped at the door when I ran down the halls to the front desk. The woman at the front desk admitted that one of the employees had lost one of her master keys that had access to all of the rooms in the hotel, something they were obligated to report to the head of the hotel. I was furious. Of course, I got a refund, gave some info to the cops, and then went home that night, where my dad actually showed something close to sympathy after I explained what happened. Ever since, I've actually never had to leave the house for the night, and I hope it stays that way. Oh yeah, and I have absolutely no idea whatever became of that crazy nutcase woman that tried to kill me. Ages ago, when I was a boy, one of my favorite things to do would be to have sleepovers with my friends, especially my friend Joe. Joe had the coolest house layout. It was big and it had this huge basement with a pool table, air hockey table, and the entire basement looped around in a big circle, and we'd often ride his scooters around the loop in the basement while on our sugar rushes after hours of playing video games and eating junk food. The best part was his parents could never hear us down there, as they slept all the way upstairs. I'll never forget the night that my mom dropped me off at Joe's house after dinner. It was the night before a holiday, so we didn't have school the next day. Joe and I went straight to the basement and started playing one of his new video games on his PlayStation 1, when suddenly the door to the laundry room in the back creaked open. He paused the game and turned around to look, and yes, the door was now cracked open. I told Joe to go check it out. He said it's fine, it happens sometimes. To be honest though, sometimes at night alone in his basement, Joe and I would get spooked. I told him to go shut the door because something about having that door open leading into a big pitch black laundry room was uncomfortable. I think he agreed because he got up to close it. After a while of playing video games, I started riding Joe's bike around the loop of the basement, which honestly was a lot more fun than it sounds. But then something else happened. There was a noise, almost like the sound of a laundry machine door being banged or closed. It came from the laundry room again, obviously. This time Joe and I ran up the stairs freaked out, and Joe called his dad to come check the laundry room. His dad opened the door to the laundry room, had a quick 5-second look, and calmly said there's no one in there. So he went back upstairs to bed, and Joe and I continued to hang out for another hour or two. Then it came time to go to sleep. There were 2 couches down there, one in front of the TV, and then another towards the back of the basement by the bar. I slept on the couch towards the back of the basement. I didn't sleep long though. I woke up and it was still pitch black in the basement, no light shining through the small basement windows. It was still the middle of the night. I rubbed my eyes and sat up after getting this weird feeling of being watched. "Joe?" I said, just checking if he was awake. After saying his name, I heard and saw something moving in the darkness to the laundry room. And then the door creaked shut. I jumped off the couch to wake up Joe, but when I got to his couch, he wasn't there. That's when I became wise to what was going on. Joe was trying to scare me. I tiptoed to the door of the laundry room. I figured I would reverse it on him and scare him instead. I put my hand on the doorknob, and after a little mental buildup, I yanked the door open and went inside screaming. I turned on the light to the room, but Joe wasn't in there. Where could he be hiding? In that moment, I was beyond confused. I knew he had to be in the room. Then I noticed something through the glass of the dryer machine. I walked over to it and knelt down. Someone was in the dryer machine, crunched up and like a ball. You know how dryer machine doors usually have a sort of tinted glass that's hard to see through? Well, while I knew there was a person in there, it took me a few seconds to catch on that the person that was in the dryer machine looking back at me was not Joe. It was some grown man. I started screaming and ran all the way upstairs to Joe's parents' room. Everyone in the house came out from their bedrooms in response, including Joe. Joe apparently was having a hard time falling asleep on the couch, so he went upstairs to his bedroom. I yelled there was someone hiding in the dryer machine. As Joe's dad started his way storming to the basement, somebody ran through the living room and out the front door. Joe's mom let out a scream as his dad ran outside in his slippers to try to catch the man. Of course, being that he was only in slippers, he didn't have a chance. When he came back, Joe's mom had already called the cops. When the cops came, they asked me if there was anything specific that I could make out about the man. All I could say was that he was wearing dark clothes. Joe and I slept in his room. I slept on the floor with a blanket, and we kept the door locked. We took a break from the sleepovers for a while after that. This happened quite some time ago. In fact, it happened back in July 2013. It was my 13th birthday party, and my friends and I had been to Manchester for the day, before heading back to my house for a sleepover. A couple of them had stayed over before, but some hadn't, so I wanted to make a good impression. We all decided to sleep downstairs that night, as there wasn't enough room in my bedroom. We gathered our sleeping bags on the living room floor, watched cheesy rom-coms, and ate junk food until around 1 a.m. So we decided to hit the sack after our third movie. We turned off the lights with the exception of one, as although we didn't like to admit it then, we were a little afraid of the dark. It's a common thing to lie awake and chat at a sleepover after you say you're going to sleep. We were in the middle of whispering to each other who we thought our celebrity lookalikes were, when we heard it. A loud knock on our window cut through our conversation. "What was that?" said Emma, one of my friends. "It's probably just my dad playing a prank or something," I said. Although this whole situation was kind of freaking me out, my dad had done this type of thing before, so I assumed it must have been him. We were beginning to calm down when suddenly another forceful knock came upon the window. This made some of my friends scream. I assured everyone that, like I said, it was probably just my dad being goofy. So I went over to the window to catch him red-handed. The curtains were closed, so I had to pull a section of them back to see who was outside. As I did, I came face to face with a man who was most certainly not my dad. This man was bald with very thin eyebrows, and he had a missing tooth. He was sort of hunched over, and he looked at me with widened, glassy eyes. I immediately screamed and closed the curtain. At this point, my friends and I were pretty hysterical, and Emma began visibly shaking in fear. My parents were upstairs, so instinctively, I ran up to find them. As I got upstairs, my mom was talking to someone from her window. I didn't quite catch their conversation, but she told me what happened soon after. She said that she heard the knocking too, and when she looked out of her window to see who it was, the man looked up and asked her if she had seen a friend of his. I can't remember the name of the guy she said she was looking for, so we'll call him Paul. He kept asking for him over and over. "Have you seen Paul? Where is Paul? Has Paul been here?" Of course, my mom said she didn't know anyone named Paul. Eventually, she had to ask him to leave us alone, as he just kept wandering around our driveway. As the man finally left, I went back downstairs to calm my friends down. In retrospect, I feel bad for leaving them alone down there when some weird stranger was on our property. We all settled back down after that. However, my mom's maternal instincts kicked in, so she wanted to make sure he was gone completely. She left briefly to go around the block in her car to make sure he wasn't still in the area. The street was dimly lit by impractical streetlights, so she had to put her high beams on. As she was driving, she saw someone dash across the middle of the road. Thinking it was just a kid, she just kept driving, until the man who was at our window appeared again. But this time, he practically jumped in front of my mom's car. My mom quickly slammed on the brakes, but before she could confront him, he disappeared off into the night. We never found out who that guy was or what his true intentions were, and thankfully, we never saw him again. So much for wanting to make a good impression. My friend Jake slept over at my house one night when we were 12, and because of that, he may have possibly saved my life. It was a snowy weekend night. We watched a couple Christmas movies in my living room. My mom would bring us snacks and hot cocoa. She was always really nice to my friends when I had them over. My mom had to go to sleep kind of early because she worked. She and my dad had just recently divorced. By around 12, Jake and I went to my room, where we played Pokemon on our Game Boy Advances for a little. I don't remember much after that, besides falling asleep a little while later. I woke up in my bed to the room being extremely cold, and also feeling really thirsty. I went to the kitchen downstairs to get a cup of water. I noticed how much colder it had become upstairs as opposed to downstairs. I went back to my bed and tucked myself in. As I lay there trying to fall back asleep, I realized Jake was breathing weird, like a deeper, heavier breathing. It went on for some time, and after making a note of it in my head, it was all I could focus on, so I eventually threw a pillow at him. As he woke up, I told him to stop breathing so loud. He was confused as he looked up at me in my bed. He said, "What are you talking about?" I told him to just lower the volume of his breathing noises, as he was borderline snoring. Jake shifted his focus from me to down below my bed, and then he screamed. He crawled backwards until his back was pushing up against my dresser. I yelled, "What is it?" I hopped off my bed and looked under it where he was staring at. There was a middle-aged man with long hair laying underneath my bed, and he had his finger up to his lips saying, "Shh." It was a surreal sight to say the least. I felt like my heart was beating 200 beats per minute. The man whispered, "I know your mom. I'm here to see her." He started crawling out from under the bed. At that same moment, Jake and I ran from the room, screaming for my mom. We got to my mom's room and locked her bedroom door behind us. She was immediately distressed and confused by our screams. I barely had enough time to yell, "There's a man under my bed," before the doorknob to my mom's room started twisting and shaking. Then the sounds of the doorknob failing to turn shifted to heavy, aggressive bangs at the door. My mom ran to her phone and called 911. She was on the phone already in tears, while also screaming at the man on the other side of the door to leave us alone. The man tried kicking the door in, but I think when he heard my mom on the phone, he left the house. We were all in shock. It took the police only a couple minutes to arrive, at which point the coast was clear. The biggest window in our house, which was the window to the upstairs spare bedroom, was lifted up completely, which explained the cool air entering the house upstairs. That also explained the man's point of entry. I told my mom that man claimed he knew her, but she had no idea who this man could have been. My mom dropped Jake off home, and then she and I slept at my aunt and uncle's house for the rest of the night. The next day, my uncle installed a stronger lock on that upstairs window. This was like 16 years ago now. At this point, it's just a distant, haunting memory. But we never figured out who that man could have been, or how he could have possibly known my mother. This is an interesting topic that a lot of you have been requesting for a long time, and I've gotten a lot of stories sent to me that happen to people while listening to my videos. Also, you can listen to all of these stories, plus a few exclusive ones on Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music by clicking the link in the description. When I was 15 years old, I would sometimes sleep over my friend JT's house. He had this cool loft bedroom that was its own floor and was attached to the attic through another half flight of stairs. When we were even younger, we used to have big hide-and-seek games in his house with our other friends and his brother. JT grew up in this big house with just his mom and his brother. His dad has always been rich, and after his parents divorced, he still paid for the house for the three of them to live in. His mom was the kind of 40-something-year-old woman to go into town every night dressed in overly tight white pants and such. When I was 14, 15, I didn't really realize what she was going out and doing all the time, but it meant he usually had the house to himself weekend nights. This was one of those nights. We smoked a bit of weed and played hours worth of Super Smash Bros. Then when it got later, we decided to watch some Mr. Nightmare videos ironically. We were on our third video, Pizza Delivery Horror Stories. This, funny enough, made us want to order a pizza, so we called one of the only pizza places around us open past 10 and ordered a pie. As we finished the current video we were on, we started watching a Craigslist horror story video, and just as we were genuinely getting spooked by one of the stories, there was a crash sound from up in the attic. The sound of a box falling over and its contents spilling out. It sounded like plastic toys. JT and I looked at each other and freaked out. We went to pause the video, and JT screamed his older brother's name, who wasn't supposed to be home. It was our first instinct to assume that it was his brother trying to scare us, but that would mean he had been hiding in the attic for hours, which seemed unlikely. Given we were already watching scary videos, this only made the situation even more unsettling. JT went up the 5 carpeted stairs towards the little attic door and opened it. He flicked on the attic light and went inside as I stood behind watching. He immediately said he saw what it was. It was a box full of Hot Wheels cars that fell and spilled out a bunch of the cars. He left it as it was and said he'd clean it tomorrow. He left the attic and shut the closet door, and right around that time the doorbell rang, causing us both to jump again. I guess we were both just really tense given the vibe of everything in the past half hour. We went downstairs to pay for the pizza and grab plates to eat and stuff. We started eating in the kitchen and planned to bring the rest of the pizza back up to his room. While we were downstairs though, we actually heard a sound from upstairs, like in the attic. The kitchen was below JT's room, and the living room was below the attic, so the living room had a higher ceiling. We walked into the living room to listen, and sure enough, we heard a faint bump that was just loud enough to hear. We again looked at each other with wide eyes. JT said there might be an animal in the attic because he'd seen YouTube videos where raccoons somehow crawl through a hole in the roof. He somehow convinced me to go check it out. I'm not sure why we were making a joke of this. I think because neither of us wanted to admit how freaked out we were. We went back to his room together, and he gave me this huge flashlight. I opened the attic door, and he was right behind me at the doorway. I turned on this huge flashlight that doubled as a radio and stepped inside. I looked at the spilled over pile of Hot Wheels. Then I looked around this city of piles of boxes. "Why am I doing this?" I said back to JT, and he laughed and said just keep looking. I stepped a little deeper into the attic to look behind this tall pile of boxes, and suddenly I felt 2 hands on my back push me. I stumbled forward and almost fell, and I heard the laugh of JT behind me. I told him he was a dick, but then, I guess in response to my sudden and loud stumble forward, something moved from beyond this other pile of boxes. I stepped up maybe 2 more feet and peered behind the boxes with the flashlight, and I was petrified. There was a guy hunched over behind the pile of boxes, and he looked right back at me. I ran back out of the attic while pushing JT out, screaming, "Go, run!" I shut the door behind us and screamed that there's someone in there. He followed me outside to the neighbor's house, who apparently wasn't home. We waited on the neighbor's stoop as we called 911. Then we called JT's mom, who seemed kinda drunk, and rushed home from her date or whatever she was doing. The police searched the house to make sure it was clear. The back door was left wide open, indicating the man escaped through there and likely climbed one of the fences to a neighboring yard. The man, from what I briefly saw, looked like a young guy, maybe in his early 30s. He had short black hair and facial hair. I was just glad this wasn't my house, because I wouldn't be comfortable sleeping there for a long time. I know JT was scared to sleep in his room for a long time after that. I was on a road trip to Las Vegas one night to meet my friends for a music festival. I was on Interstate 15, which is mostly just desert the whole way to Vegas. I chose to do the drive at night to avoid traffic. I left my house around 8 p.m., and my GPS said I'd get to my friend's Airbnb around midnight. On long drives, I usually listen to podcasts and such because I start getting tired of music after a few hours. I started listening to Mr. Nightmare stories to pass the time, as they made the time seem to go quicker. Given that I was having a road trip, I listened to the road trip themed stories. About 3 hours into the drive, I had to stop for gas, so I added a detour to the route on my GPS, and it showed me where to get off for the closest gas station. It was a few miles away. I got off the next exit ramp into some sketchy looking area. There were a few houses, then just desert. It was such an odd place for a few houses to be. I pulled up to this generic gas station, the only light source to be seen for pretty much miles. There were only 4 pumps total at this little station. I pulled up next to the one closest to the door to the inside. I went inside to pay the worker for the gas and buy a couple snacks. Not to use a derogatory term, but the guy working there seemed like kind of a hick. He had an unkempt, stained-looking beard, some dirty red trucker hat on, and the way he spoke was kind of creepy. But out here in the middle of nowhere, I didn't know what else I really expected. He tried making conversation with me, asking where I was from. That struck me as him realizing I'm not from around here. I told him I was from Cali. I asked him if he gets a lot of customers here. Kind of a weird question on my part looking back, but whatever. He said not really, not my kind at least. Then he gave me a gross smile. I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded off-putting and like a creepy flirt. The man then looked out the window toward my car and said, "Is that your friend?" I looked outside and got a glimpse of someone walking quickly into the darkness. It looked like they were just by my car. I said no, I don't know them, and asked the cashier what that guy just did. He shrugged his shoulders and said he didn't see. Being admittedly an attractive girl in her 20s, I deal with creepy stuff all the time, so I almost wanted to ask the cashier if he could accompany me outside to make me feel better. But honestly, I was creeped out by the cashier as well. I went outside to the pump to start filling up the tank of my car. I looked around the empty gas station lot. There was just a humming from one of the lights of the canopy above me and the sound of the cold night breeze. There were no cars or lights as far as the eye could see. Where did that guy go? And what was he doing? I looked at the window of the gas station shop and saw the cashier standing there looking directly at me. I wondered if he was doing it to make sure I was okay after that sketchy person ran off into the darkness. But that thought was negated when he started waving at me slowly. It was disgustingly creepy, and I wanted to get out of there. I paid for $40 worth of gas. When I was around the 30 mark, I heard something from the small building, like a voice. I looked over to the window, expecting it to be the cashier who made the noise, but he was still inside, just standing at the window looking at me. Then I noticed where the sound came from. There was a man peering his head around the right side wall of the small gas station store. He was waving his hands at me, motioning for me to come over, and I'm pretty sure I saw a creepy smile on his face too. I started waving and calling for the cashier in the store. He didn't move though. He just stood there, motionless, looking at me as I called for him and waved my arms. I looked back at the creepy guy who was peering his head around the corner, and he was still there, but now he wasn't hiding behind the wall anymore. He was standing fully exposed until he noticed me notice him, then started walking towards me. I removed the nozzle from my gas tank and left it dangling. I called at the cashier for help one more time. He still just stood there, motionless, looking at me. I felt my heart in my throat. This was a textbook scene directly from a Mr. Nightmare story. I got in my car and sped out of there, back on the basically deserted road, and eventually back onto the interstate. My heart was racing after that for a few minutes. Needless to say, I stopped listening to Mr. Nightmare for the rest of that road trip. I got safely to the Airbnb about an hour after that ordeal. I still have no idea what to make of it. I rent a house in Gulfport, Mississippi. It's a small house but perfect for one person. I live alone with my dog Gringo. The backyard is big for him to run around in, and the area is pretty nice, right by the beach too. This happened on a summer night, I think a Thursday. I had just finished preparing my lunch for tomorrow and finished cleaning up the kitchen. Before going to sleep, I laid in my bed and ironically was actually watching Mr. Nightmare videos. I always like to think these videos would help me know what to do in a worst case scenario situation like a home invasion or anything of the sorts. I'm sure a lot of people feel that way, but honestly, none of us ever expect something like that to happen to us. Sure, it happens to other people, but never you, right? Well, it must have been like 11:30 at night, and I was literally watching a video when the doorbell rang and Gringo started barking. Hearing the doorbell any time past 10 o'clock honestly is bone-chilling. It raises immediate red flags and questions, like who is it and what could they want at this hour? I didn't leave my bed. I was not going to leave my bedroom to check who it could be. I was downright horrified just from the sound of the doorbell. Gringo is a pretty big dog and you can hear it in his bark, so I hoped the sound of his barks would deter anyone with bad intentions. But the doorbell rang again, and the dread of wondering who was out there and why were they at my doorstep became even worse. The doorbell was followed by loud knocking. I still didn't leave my bed. I wasn't going to go out there. When it finally seemed to stop, I felt a little relieved. Since the house is only one floor, my bedroom was ground level. My window kind of looks out to the street in front of the house, so I looked out the window just to see if anyone would be walking down the street. I stood there watching for maybe 30 seconds before I heard footsteps outside near the window. I hurried back into the bed to hide. Gringo was growling and looking out the window. I told him to be quiet. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence and said, "I see you. Open the window." The voice was right outside the window. Gringo started to bark again. I still did not look. The guy outside my window said, "Hey doggy." Gringo was going crazy. I couldn't realistically keep pretending to be asleep. I turned over to look at the window. I was looking at a creepy man with his eyes open super wide, looking back at me, with the only thing separating us being the bug screen of the window. I asked, "What do you want?" And he repeated himself and said, "Can you let me in? It's cold out here." But it was literally a midsummer night in Mississippi. I said leave before I call the police. This was when he tried lifting the screen himself, and when he realized he couldn't, he started punching at it to break a hole in it. I quickly slid the window shut and locked it. I was shocked Gringo's loud barks weren't scaring this guy off. I asked the 911 operator to please send police to my house, and of course, like in so many stories I've heard before, the police showed up too late because the man was gone. He was probably on some kind of drugs. I have no idea what kind, but I could just hear it in his voice. And that comment that it was cold outside was also a dead giveaway. I don't think there was really any other appropriate way to handle this other than locking the window right away and calling 911. My aunt and uncle live in Fort Myers, Florida. Every winter we visit them for a weekend just to see them and escape the cold. This has been a long-time tradition dating back to when they first moved there about 15 years ago, so we'd been doing this almost as long as I could remember. This happened back when I was 12. My cousin Ashley, who was a year older than me, would always be there, of course, so the two of us would hang out a lot during these visits. She was cool to hang out with, and I related to her a lot, even though I was a young boy and she's a girl. She'd always be down to do the cool stuff that I'd normally do with my friends at that age. After the family dinner on the first night there, we all watched a movie together. After the movie, our parents hung out with each other in the kitchen drinking wine. They wouldn't let Ashley and I go out that late, as we were only 12 and 13, but Ashley wanted to go to a nearby canal where locals were apparently reporting having seen a 10-foot-long alligator. Basically, we both wanted to go see if we could find the gator after she convinced me. We snuck out through the back door while our parents were still in the kitchen. On our way to the canal, we stopped at the 7-Eleven on the street so we could get some snacks on the way. The cashier already told us to be careful out there, implying it was late for us to be out. The streets were deserted at this hour. The area of Fort Myers in which they live is on the significantly quieter side. We walked for like 10 minutes, and the closer we got to this canal she kept talking about, the swampier the sides of the road started to get. Ashley froze in front of me and looked straight ahead. She pointed ahead and said, "What's that guy doing?" I saw right away what she meant. At the far end of the street, there was the silhouette of this man, just standing completely still on the sidewalk. If he was walking or perhaps looking down at something in his hands, it would have been different. But him just standing still doing nothing, apparently looking off straight ahead, it just sent shivers down both our spines. Ashley said this was the only way to get to the canal, unless we cut through people's yards or gross sewage-type water.
So we continued walking, but slower, more cautious now. We were half the distance from the man now, when he suddenly turned around. I don't mean he turned his head. No, he literally turned his whole body around at once without even taking a peek to see if we were coming first or anything. We stopped. He was facing us, no doubt. There was a bit of a standoff for a few seconds before he lifted his arm and started waving at us. It wasn't a normal, gentle wave of a hand. No, he was waving his whole arm. It soon transitioned into him making a come here motion with his arm. Ashley and I looked at each other, then started running away down the street, back the way we came. We got winded pretty quickly and stopped to catch our breath in front of some small yellow house. We sat on the grass of the property for a second, just gathering our thoughts. Ashley told me there are a lot of weird people that live down there, especially in the area we were just walking. Now I understood why her parents didn't want her out this late alone. We got up after a couple minutes and started walking back to her house when we saw him again. That guy was at the end of the street, not moving once again. He was as still as he was before, his same exaggeratedly stiff, arms flatted side posture. He was directly under a streetlight this time, so we could see his features. He was like 40. His hair seemed to be slightly slicked back. His nose seemed to be fucked up, like it was bent to the side. He was smiling too. He wasn't showing teeth though, it was a closed-mouthed smile. He once again started waving at us. Then, I still don't know why, Ashley got up and waved back at him. As she did this, he stopped waving and his smile disappeared. It was only a few seconds later that he erupted into a full-on sprint towards us. Ashley started screaming and running. I got up off the ground and ran as fast as I could after her. I was in pure shock. I think that's why I couldn't get a scream out. That and it would take extra breath that I didn't have. We ran through people's yards, hopped over fences, and ran down different streets until we finally made it back to her house. The back door was locked now, so unfortunately we had to knock on the door, exposing us. Trying to avoid getting in trouble, we simply said we ran to 7-Eleven to get snacks. While Ashley's parents were more upset than mine, they let us off with just a slap on the wrist, telling us not to go out again at that hour. That man's face lit up under that streetlight still terrifies me to this day, 10 years later. My two friends and I were having a sleepover on one of the last summer nights before the new school year started. We didn't want to end it on a dull note, so we decided later that night that we would sneak out and walk about a mile to our local high school. We live in a small town in the middle of bumfuck Massachusetts, so everything is close. Around 12 a.m., both my friends and I left the house and started making our way to the high school. The way there was uneventful, just us walking down the road laughing, sometimes yelling, just being typical dumb teenagers like always. We walked in the middle of the road because it was late and there was hardly any traffic in general. It took about 20 minutes to make it to the high school, where all we did was lay on the turf field, look up at the stars, and talk about the summer, as well as other stupid shit that made us laugh. We actually had such a good time that we laid there for almost an hour, so when we decided to walk back, it was close to 1 o'clock. As we made our way down the road back home, we approached a T intersection. That's where we saw a car. We noticed the car was just sitting there at the stop sign, which was on our side of the road. We could only see the headlights because the rest of the car was blocked by a row of trees. No cars were coming either. Of course, it was 1 o'clock in the morning, but the car didn't move. It just sat there. My friends and I continued to approach the intersection. Suddenly, the car slowly moved further out of the intersection, turned in our direction, and began driving past us. We made out the car to be an old white Mustang. As it passed, my friend yelled something stupid about the car being a V6, making fun of it. It was funny for about 0.8 seconds until the vehicle slammed on the brakes. I felt my heart go into my throat as the car peeled into a fast U-turn. I yelled to my friends, "Run," and we all ran down the street. We ran onto the joining road where we first saw the car coming out of. As soon as I made it near the row of trees, I jumped into the woods. So did my friends a few yards down the road. We had about 3 seconds to spare before the car turned down the road. He started slow rolling down the street like he was looking for us, and when he didn't see us, he stopped. Out stepped 2 large men, one holding a massive rod. I muttered "fuck" under my breath as I hid in the leaves. They began walking towards the tree line. I quietly covered my mouth to conceal my breathing. My heart was beating so fast and hard I felt like they would hear it too. The driver, who had a big metal rod in his hand, yelled threats at us into the woods. He continued looking into the woods, along with his buddy. I could feel their eyes pass me over and over again. They just stood there, watching, listening for one of us to make a sound. If he walked only a few more yards from the tree line into the woods, he would find me. His buddy said, "Fuck it, let's go," as he started walking back to the passenger side of the car. "There'll be others out," he said. The driver took one last look into the woods and hopped into his car. The car turned around and took off back down the road past the high school leading out of town. I stayed in the woods for another couple of minutes, waiting to see if the car would come back, which it didn't. I stepped out, along with my friends further down the road, and we all ran all the way home. We made it back and tried to enjoy the rest of our night. We tried to laugh about it later, but deep down, we knew how scary that was. We thought it was just another crazy experience, until 2 days later, when we found out through some local friends of ours that a white Mustang was stolen and involved in a robbery from the next town over, the same night we were chased. I could only imagine what would have happened if those two men decided to walk further into the woods. When I was 16, I had a curfew. I wasn't allowed out past 12 on the weekends. My friend Jose was lucky enough to not have a curfew. It was a Saturday in 2013. My parents were asleep. Jose wanted to go explore some abandoned hospital across town, so I snuck out of my room very quietly and tiptoed down the stairs. I exited through the back door and grabbed my bike from the shed, then I left on my way to Jose's house. From there, I met him and we rode across town. It took about 10 minutes. I followed him the whole way, until we ended up at this fenced-off property. Inside of the perimeter was this tall brick building. It didn't look that old. It was once an active hospital many years ago. The town just never bothered to tear it down. We parked our bikes in a big bush out of sight. Next step was hopping the fence, which was easy. The third step was finding a way into the building. We scanned the perimeter by walking around the building, until we found a basement-level window that was already broken open. Jose went in first. I shined my flashlight into the window for him so he could see. It looked a little scary down there, considering how dark it was. Nevertheless, I wasn't going to bitch out now. It was my turn to enter while he held the light. Once we were in and both had our flashlights on, though, it was pretty well lit. There wasn't much in this basement level we entered into. It seemed to be mostly for storage and boiler-type rooms. We found a stairway upstairs, and once we went through this rusty door, we were on the main floor, in this hallway that still had some of the lights on. It sounds weird, but having some of the hospital lights still on just made this more eerie. Like we were a little more worried about running into someone. It's not like the whole place was lit up. There would be like one light on here and one light on down the hall, with lots of pitch black corners and dark gaps in between. There was also this loud buzzing, whistling sound that we couldn't pinpoint. It was kind of creepy. We started exploring by taking a look into each little room. Most of the expensive stuff seemed to be cleared out, like the beds and equipment. The place was kind of clean for an abandoned building, though. It seemed not many people explored it. That or just previous people didn't trash it. Though there were some holes in the walls, and some things thrown on the floors, as expected. There was one room with the door closed. We tried opening it, but it was locked. Extremely weird, considering every other door was opened. Jose had a good point, though. Patients' sleeping room doors aren't permitted to have locks on them, so that meant something was blocking the door. We also heard noises on the other side of the door, like very, very light thump sounds. We went into the adjacent room, and there were a bunch of tiny holes in the walls. There was one hole in the wall adjacent to the next room over with the blocked door, a hole big enough to look through. I quietly got on my knees to look through it. My eyes had to adjust to the darkness, but after a second, I could see a woman in a long white dress, leaning on the far wall, seemingly looking at the door to the room. I was truly about to piss myself after seeing her. I whispered to Jose to look. He didn't believe me, but when he looked through the door, he gasped. We whispered to each other, wondering if we should get out. Jose said yes. He stood up and went to the door to the room. I got on my knees one more time to look through the hole again. As I put my eye up to the hole, the entire room was now blocked, because the woman had gotten on her knees and was looking through the hole back at me with this huge smile on her face. I screamed so loud it definitely echoed throughout the whole building. Jose didn't even ask why, he just ran for it with me back to the way we came in the basement. He crawled up through the window first, then me. The whole time I was trying to squeeze through the window, I was scared she was going to come up behind me and pull my legs back in. When we were both outside, we ran for our bikes and pedaled all the way back to Jose's. We didn't laugh about it at all. It genuinely was nightmare fuel. I went straight home after saying bye to him. I didn't feel safe being anywhere but inside my house, in my bed. I don't believe in ghosts, so I don't believe that was a ghost. I believe there was actually some psychotic woman in there. But all I'm saying is if I did believe in ghosts, I would 100% believe that's what I saw in that room.
I love the sound of falling snow. It's kind of like watching lightning or seeing a shooting star. It's just one of those unique things you have no control over that doesn't always present itself. But when it does, it's a treat. I'm not really the hiking type, but when it's snowing out, I just can't help myself. We've all got those irresistible cravings. This happened during one of those snowy nights. I live in a woodsy area. It's not really in the woods per se, but it's close enough. If I wanted to access an expansive, dense forest, I'd only have to drive a few minutes. I didn't have any major obligations the next day, so it was either a Friday or Saturday. Probably a Saturday because I remember being slightly hungover from going out the previous night. It also wasn't supposed to snow that night, which I remember specifically because I have a habit of checking the weather obsessively during the winter months. I was sitting in my room reading a book when it just started snowing. Abruptly, as if someone had just casually flipped a switch. I didn't even notice it at first, but by the time I realized what was going on, there was already a considerable amount of snow on the ground. Without thinking too much, I instantly knew what I wanted to do. Take a snow walk, so that's what I did. The spot I drove to is pretty secluded for the most part. It's a local hiking trail that usually doesn't see that much traffic. I stepped out, admired the snowfall for a few seconds, and started walking. I didn't really have a defined plan in my mind. My only objective was to get deeper into the woods so I could more fully appreciate the snow. After about 20 minutes of walking, I was finally satisfied with how far I'd gone. But then, the literal moment I stopped to appreciate the snow, I heard something. Something that definitely didn't belong there. It was a child's voice. It took me a few moments to even process what I heard. Just as I was telling myself my mind was playing tricks on me, I heard it again. The sound of a little boy yelling, "Hi." I know that sounds pretty benign, but it was just so freaky in the moment. It was quite literally the last thing I was expecting to hear out there, all alone in those woods. The other unsettling thing about it was that I couldn't really tell where the voice had come from. It sounded like it could have come from a number of different directions, if that makes any sense. I whipped my head around, but there was no one there. I kept looking around frantically, but there was no one in sight. Just as I was about to head back to my car, I heard the voice again. It was definitely a little boy's voice, only this time, he said, "Up here, silly." Without even processing how freaky of a thing that is to say, I instinctively looked up, and there he was. There was a little boy who looked to be around 9 years old just sitting on a tree branch in a tree not too far away. It was the most bizarre thing. The boy was clearly bundled up for the cold, but how he managed to climb that tree, I had no idea. The lowest branch to the ground was at least 20 feet off the ground. Strangely, seeing him kind of calmed me down a little. It was almost like I had been afraid of not knowing where he was as opposed to him being there. I walked over to the tree he was sitting on, keeping my eyes on him the entire time. He was smiling this really wide grin that reminded me of the expression someone who hadn't learned to smile yet would make. My sense of security started disappearing the more I looked around, though. For starters, there wasn't a single footprint around the tree he was sitting in, meaning he had climbed up there before it had started snowing, meaning he had been sitting in that tree for at least 45 minutes. And that's not even mentioning the fact that he figured out a way to climb that thing in the first place. Like I said, it would have been exceedingly difficult to do so, even if you had climbing experience. The tree was perfectly straight. He would have had to shimmy up 20 feet. He waved at me, and I didn't waste a second. I asked him how he got up there, and he told me it was a secret. Then he just went back to smiling that awful grin. I didn't know what to do. This kid clearly didn't belong out there, and I felt compelled to do something. But what was I supposed to do? Try and climb the tree to get him down? Before I could think of something to say, he stood up straight on the branch he had been sitting on and said, "Watch this." Then without warning, he leaned back and fell. He fell what must have been at least 30 feet. I screamed. There was nothing else I could do. I watched in horror as he landed directly on his back with a gruesome thud. I thought he was dead. There's no way any amount of snow could have cushioned that fall. I ran over to him, but before I could reach him, he sprung up off the ground and started running away from me. It was impossible. Falling from that height should have been enough to kill him. I screamed again, this time out of shock, and I watched as he ran off deeper into the woods. Even with the bright snow on the ground, it was still dark enough for him to run out of sight. I don't know what came over me. Instead of doing the rational thing and turning around, I ran after him. I don't know why. I know myself. If a situation like that were to arise again, I'd turn around 99 times out of 10. But I guess this was just that one time. That's the only explanation I can come up with. I regained my composure and started following his footprints, knowing he couldn't have gotten far. After a few seconds of running, I started to hear him laughing. Cackling is a better word, honestly. It was really unsettling. It was like he was toying with me, playing a game while I was out there scared to death. His footprints passed a nearby tree, and as I was running past, I felt something latch onto my back. Before I could react, I was tumbling to the ground, and this kid was on top of me, clawing at my neck and shoulders. I started screaming and blindly grabbed at him, but he wasn't letting go. He started wailing too, and I could feel myself starting to bleed. He was tearing into my neck with his fingernails, and I thought he was going to blind me. I managed to stand back up, and with all my strength, I flung him over my shoulder. He hit the ground, immediately got up, and ran deeper into the woods, still laughing. This time I didn't chase him. If it weren't for the cuts on my neck and the blood on my hands, I might have just stood there forever. The cuts didn't feel that deep, but there was an uncomfortable amount of blood. I hadn't been wearing a scarf, so I pulled off my hat and wrapped it tightly around my neck. My hands were shaking and soaked with my own blood, and I was having a panic attack. The next 20 minutes are really fuzzy, probably because I was so terrified and I had lost so much blood. The next thing I remember is being in the back of an ambulance, and then after that, I remember talking to some police officers about what happened. I got the medical attention I needed and was asked to recount my story like 10 times. At the time, I didn't realize what was so unbelievable about it. I would only later learn that while I had been in the hospital, the police had searched the area and found nothing. What's worse, they allegedly followed my footprints and only found the one set, mine. I remember being so emotionally distraught when I found that out. I was furious at the thought that they hadn't searched the woods thoroughly. But why would they lie? By the time I was discharged from the hospital and done talking to police officers, I didn't have much energy to do anything other than sleep. I can't remember if this was the day after or 2 days after. Like I said, things got a bit fuzzy, but I eventually went back to that hiking trail. It had snowed considerably since then, so it wasn't too surprising to find that my footprints had been snowed in. I searched the entire forest. It must have taken me hours, but there was no sign anyone had been there. This is still one of the freakiest things that has ever happened to me or anyone I personally know. This happened over winter break my sophomore year of college. I was 19 and had the house to myself for a little under 2 weeks. During the second week, a massive snowstorm hit. The forecasts were predicting something crazy, and they definitely weren't lying. By the time I woke up that Saturday, there was already close to a foot on the ground, and it was still coming down hard. Plows couldn't keep up, and by late afternoon, the roads were basically impassable. I should mention that my neighborhood isn't your typical suburban setup. The houses are pretty spread out, and there's a lot of wooded areas between properties. It's nice in the summer, but in the winter it can feel kind of isolated. That day, with the snow piling up and no cars on the road, it felt even more so. I was bored out of my mind by like 6 p.m. The Wi-Fi knocked out while I was sleeping, so I couldn't even pass the time by playing video games or anything. For context, my only hometown friend is this guy named Ryan, and I knew he was around because I had literally hung out with him the day before. So while I was dying of boredom in my room, I got this idea that I thought was hilarious at the time. I was going to walk to his house and surprise him. The roads were undrivable, sure, but I figured I could make it on foot. It was only about 1.5 miles, maybe a little more. I'd walked further than that plenty of times. Looking back, it was a pretty stupid idea, but I was 19 and bored and thought it would be funny to just show up on his doorstep covered in snow. The first part of the walk was actually kind of nice. The snow had stopped falling by then, and everything was covered in this thick white blanket. The streetlights made everything glow, and it was weirdly peaceful. I could hear my own breathing and the crunch of my boots, but that was about it. There wasn't a living thing out there. About halfway there, the route cuts through this stretch where there aren't any houses for a while. It's mostly just trees on both sides of the road and a few empty lots. During the day, it's nothing special, but that night, especially with all that snow, it felt different. That's when it really hit me how alone I was. It was a really strange feeling. I kept walking, and out of nowhere, I saw headlights up ahead. The lights were pretty far off, but they were coming from the direction I was headed. I stopped walking and watched them get closer. It was definitely a snowplow, and it was moving really slowly. But then out of nowhere, it suddenly veered hard to the right, like the driver had lost control or was trying to avoid something. I watched them cut across the road and disappear into the tree line. There was this muffled crunching sound, and then everything went quiet again. My first thought was that someone had just crashed, so I started running toward where I'd seen the lights go off the road. The snow was deep, and I couldn't move that fast. But the only thing on my mind was the thought that someone was hurt and needed help. It took me a few minutes to reach the spot. I could see where the vehicle had gone off the road, so I followed the tire tracks until I found it. The scene looked exactly as I predicted. A snowplow with its front end crumpled and smashed into a tree. Its headlights were still on and the engine was still running. I ran up to the driver's side, preparing myself to have to lift someone through the snow, but when I got to the window and looked inside, there was no one there. The driver's seat was empty. I stood there for a second, not really processing what I was seeing. I thought maybe the driver had been thrown from the vehicle or something, so I looked around. The windshield wasn't shattered though, so they must have still been inside the plow. I checked the passenger side, but that seat was also empty. I ended up pulling the driver's door open in frustration, thinking maybe they had slumped down below the steering wheel, but there was no one there either. It took me a few seconds to realize that the entire plow was empty. There was quite literally nowhere else someone could have been. I remember just standing there in the snow, staring at this wrecked snowplow with its headlights still on and its engine still running, feeling like something was very, very wrong. There were no footprints leading away from the truck. Whoever had been driving the thing had just vanished. It's hard for me to describe what I felt next. I got this sudden, overwhelming sense that I needed to leave. It wasn't a thought so much as a feeling, like something in my gut was forcing me to get out of there. I trusted my gut and backed away from the plow. As I was walking back the way I had came, I heard a voice ring out from somewhere behind me. It was a man's voice, and he was yelling for help. I wanted to turn around and help. That was my goal in the first place, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep moving. I started running, and as I got further away, I heard the voice yell out one more time. It sounded much closer the second time, like impossibly close. No one could have moved that fast through such deep snow. I didn't turn around. I ran the entire rest of the way to Ryan's house. The joke was pretty much ruined at that point. I must have looked insane when his mom answered the door. I explained what happened, and Ryan's dad ended up calling the police. In the time it took the police to get out there and back amidst all that snow, Ryan and I had gone back and forth about what I'd seen probably a dozen times. He kept asking if maybe I imagined it, or if maybe the driver had walked away before I got there, but I knew for a fact that my eyes hadn't been playing tricks on me. When the police got to Ryan's house, they revealed something horrifying. Apparently, they hadn't found any tire tracks on that round at all. They had searched the entire road, but there was no sign that a plow had ever even been there. The officer actually accused me of making the entire thing up, and I had to argue my case. I was practically begging them to believe me. The officer ended up just leaving, and there was nothing I could do about it. I stayed at Ryan's that night. I didn't want to walk back home in the dark, and honestly, I don't think I could have even if I wanted to. The next morning, after the plows had finally cleared the roads, Ryan's dad drove me home. I've thought about that night a lot since then, and every time I do, I come to the unfortunate conclusion that what happened to me is just one of those unexplainable things. I guess it's possible that I hallucinated the whole thing, but that terrifies me just as much. I'm Sebastian, and I go by Sebi. This happened back when I was a sophomore in high school, about 7 years ago now. I went to a private school in a nearby city, which meant I had to commute on public transportation every day. Train in the morning, train in the afternoon. It sounds tedious, but honestly, I didn't mind it. Most of my friends lived in the same general area, so we'd all ride together, and it became this social thing where we'd just hang out and talk during the commute. One of the hidden benefits of private school, honestly, getting people accustomed to commuting early in life. I was a runner back then, track in the spring, cross country in the fall. During the off-season, I'd catch the train right after school let out around 3, and it would be pretty empty, usually just the same group of high schoolers heading home. But during the season, practice wouldn't wrap up until after 5:30, which meant by the time I got on the train, it was packed with commuters heading back to the suburbs after work. Luckily, my two best friends Charles and James also ran track and lived on the same train line, so I wasn't completely alone during those late rides. One night after track practice, it started snowstorming the moment our train left the station. It was midwinter, so night is definitely the right term, even though it wasn't even 6 yet. And snowstorm is also the right term because it went from 0 to full-on blizzard in like 5 minutes. We found out while we were on the train that ours was the last one operating on that track. The forecast was predicting a massive storm, and they weren't letting any more trains leave the station after us. The snow only got worse. At one point, the three of us were genuinely wondering if the train was even going to make it to each of our stops, and even so, we quickly realized there was no way our parents could drive to pick us up. The roads were already a mess, so even if we made it to our respective stations, we'd have no choice but to walk home. For James and Charles, that wasn't a huge deal. They were practically next-door neighbors in a pretty lively, dense part of town, plus their houses weren't that far from the station. For me, though, it was different. My station was isolated. I'd have to cross a highway and then walk over a mile in this woodsy stretch to get home. I called my parents from the train and explained the situation. They told me I didn't have much of a choice. My dad told me to just suck it up, bundle up, and be careful. James and Charles got off at their stop, and I dapped them goodbye. The rest of the ride was just me and a handful of other passengers, and by the time we reached my station, I was the only one left. The doors opened and I stepped out onto the platform. It was completely empty, just me and a full blizzard. It was dark, but there was decent visibility because of the snow. Everything was white, and the light from the station reflected off of it in this pretty but eerie way. I stood there for a second, taking it in. It was a sight I had never seen before. Usually that station is bustling with cars and people, but with the snowstorm and all, it looked completely deserted. I started walking. There was no point in prolonging the inevitable. For whatever reason, I thought crossing the highway would have been more difficult, but there wasn't a single car anywhere in sight, including snowplows. I actually stopped and looked around, kind of in awe. It was beautiful in a weird way. I started thinking to myself I'd probably never experience anything like that ever again. After the highway, though, came the woods. The only other option was following the road home, but it was really windy and would have added a ton more walking, so I decided to just push through and walk through the woods. I don't know how long I'd been walking, but I happened to glance up after looking down at my feet for a while, and the moment I did, I had to hold back a yell. About 30 yards ahead of me, there was someone standing there, a man. He was facing me directly, almost like he knew the exact path I had to take. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing because he wasn't dressed for the weather at all. He was wearing a short-sleeved shirt and shorts in the middle of a blizzard, and to make things worse, his face was twisted in this deranged smile. I didn't move. I just stood there watching him, waiting to see what he was going to do. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some explanation, but the shock of the situation was too much for me to handle. I couldn't think or move, and in one abrupt motion, he went from smiling and standing still to screaming and charging at me. It was literal horror unfolding right in front of me. I snapped out of my haze and began running as fast as I could back the way I came, screaming for help even though I knew no one was out there. I couldn't move that fast with all the snow, and I felt him closing the gap with every second that passed. The chase felt like it lasted forever. It was probably 5 minutes, but it felt like an hour. I finally broke out of the woods and hit the road, and only then did I turn around. He was gone, and that didn't make me feel much better though. I felt physically sick. I followed the road home, and the whole time I kept thinking about my footprints, about how they were quite literally the only tracks in the snow. If that guy wanted to follow me home, it would have been the easiest thing in the world. When I finally got to my house, my parents were relieved. That is, until I told them what had happened in the woods. My dad wanted to go out and look for the guy, but my mom wouldn't let him. Several hours went by without incident. Eventually, my parents went to sleep. I pretended like everything was fine, but I was still freaking out internally. I couldn't get the image of his deranged smile out of my head. And the way he had been screaming was just so unnatural. And the more I thought about it, the more insane the whole thing felt. He had literally been wearing short sleeves. How had he not frozen to death out there? I was making myself crazy, so I forced myself to stop thinking about it and just go to sleep. But of course, I couldn't fall asleep. It was like I was in that 30-second shock after waking up from a nightmare, only instead of 30 seconds, it was several hours. That's the best way I can describe how I was feeling. At one point, I heard a tree branch rattle my bedroom window, which startled me out of bed. I went over to the window to see if I could dislodge it somehow. I pulled back the curtain and literally dropped to the floor, yelling. It was him, that guy from earlier. He was right there, inches from my window, only now I could see him clearly. His skin was purple, like he was freezing to death, and he was bald with this patchy gray beard. My dad burst into the room and just barely saw that guy through the window before he took off. My dad went to go run out in the snow, but my mom stopped him and convinced him to call the police instead, which he did. With all the snow on the grounds, it took the police forever to get to our house. By the time they did, that guy was long gone. My dad didn't care though. The police could have easily tracked his footprints in the snow, which is what I was expecting them to do. But once the officers realized the tracks led into the woods behind our house, they told us they couldn't just go tramping through the woods in the middle of the night. My dad got furious. He got in one of the officers' faces and almost made it physical. In the end, the officers literally left without doing a thing. Nothing ever came of it. The police never bothered to follow up, and I never saw that man again. For all I know, he froze to death somewhere behind my house. But for weeks after that, I was terrified to be in my own home. I still have absolutely no idea how to explain what happened. I've been with my company now for a good amount of time. I'd say probably about 6 years now. Thanks to the amount of time I've put in, I have seniority over the other associates. Not to mention, I have a lot more training and credentials under my belt than they do. The company recently picked up a new contract for some kind of big government office building. Where it's located is rather strange for it to be a government office building. I won't get into exact locations, but to give you an idea of what the area it's located in looks like, and what makes it so strange, is that it's located in damn near the middle of nowhere. It's a giant 6-story building surrounded by a giant parking lot. The parking lot is surrounded by a metal fence that's about 10 feet tall. On the top of the fence is barbed wire. There's only one way in and one way out in front of the building at the opening of the parking lot that meets the side road that it's located off of. The side road is about 3 miles away from the main road, which leads to the highway. The fence is completely surrounded by woods. There are literally no buildings, houses, or any other signs of civilization for miles around. Due to my seniority, I get to work whatever shifts and days I want. Typically, I choose to work mornings or evenings and have weekends or Fridays and Saturdays off. But unfortunately, after a few months of us being at this new contract, we started having trouble keeping the overnight people. During the day, there's usually about 3 guards working all 7 days of the week. On the overnight shift during the weekdays, there's 2 guards, and on the overnight shift during the weekend, starting Friday to Sunday, there was only 1 guard. I should mention before I go any further that every guard is armed on every shift. As I said, we're having trouble keeping people on the overnight shift, mainly on the weekend overnight shift. Because of this, my supervisor asked me if I could help out until they could hire more people and work some overtime on the weekend overnight shifts. I could have, and in hindsight should have said no thanks, but at the time I actually needed the extra money because I was getting ready to move to a new apartment soon. So I went ahead and accepted the extra shifts. The first couple of weeks were fine. No issues, nothing strange. But what happened on the 3rd weekend is what made me regret my decision for the overtime. It was a Saturday night around 2 a.m. There was a very bad thunderstorm going on outside. I was sitting in the camera control room, which is on the top floor. The control room has a window that oversees the back part of the parking lot. In the room, there's 3 large-sized computer screens that show the CCTV live feeds from all the cameras located throughout the building, as well as the few cameras that are outside in the parking lot and by the entrance/exit of the parking lot. I was sitting in the control room doing what I normally was doing while working overnight by myself. I had the lights off watching movies I previously downloaded on my phone, while also playing games on my Game Boy. I had been sitting down for a while and got up to stretch my legs and move around a bit. I was also starting to feel a little sleepy and was thinking about going down the hall to the vending machine and grabbing an energy drink. After I got up and walked around the control room for a bit, stretching my legs, I went over to the window, peeked through the blinds to look outside. As I was watching, I was looking at all the heavy wind and rain blowing the random debris around. I was just about to walk away from the window to grab that energy drink, when all of a sudden, a flash of lightning lit up the surrounding area past the fence. And just then, I saw a figure dart from one tree to another that was a good distance from it, I'd say about 20 feet. I kept my position, looking in that direction through the blinds, waiting for another flash of lightning to see if I could see exactly what it was, or if my eyes were playing tricks on me. After a couple of seconds went by, another flash struck. This time, I didn't see anything near or around the tree that I saw the figure move to. At that point, I thought clearly my eyes were playing tricks on me and that it was just me being tired. I left from the window and went down the hall and got the energy drink. I immediately downed the whole thing, hoping that it would kick in soon. I was finished with it by the time it took me to walk back to the control room, which wasn't long, only about 5 minutes. I got back to the control room, and I immediately noticed that one of the camera feeds had been knocked out on one of the screens. It was the camera feed to the back part of the parking lot that the window overlooked. I went over to the window and looked out the blinds in the direction of the camera. I spotted it dangling in the wind from its wires from the post that it was on. I figured the heavy winds must have knocked it off somehow. I sat back at my desk and put in my report for the night, and then went back to what I was originally doing. A few minutes had passed while I was watching a movie on my phone, and I heard the alert sound the system gives when someone is accessing a part of the building that requires a code to be entered on a keypad. I looked at the main screen and pulled up the tab that shows the access points of the building. It showed me the one being accessed was the one in the back of the building by the back parking lot. At that point, a shiver ran down my spine as I realized someone was outside. From the shadow figure, to the camera being knocked out, and now to this, the keypad being accessed. Whoever it was had the code because they got in, and the system showed me the green light. I thought to myself, it couldn't be another worker or security guard. If it was a worker, we would have a memo telling us who it was and what times they would be here, as well as what part of the building they would be in. I knew it wasn't a security guard because I would have known about that too. I picked up the phone that was on my desk in an attempt to call the cops, but it was out. I looked at my phone, and of course, no service. I figured the best thing to do would be to try to walk around the hallway and try to get service on my phone. I left out of the control room and into the hallway. I started walking down the hallway toward the service stairwell while looking at my phone, hoping to get a signal soon. Just then, as I was looking down at my phone, the power was shut off. I immediately decided, since I was so close to the stairs, that I was going to run down the stairs to the front lobby and run out the door to my truck. I got to the stairwell and opened it up. It was damn near pitch black in there. I decided to use the darkness to my advantage and walk quietly down the steps. I figured if this person cut the power, they had to be in the generator room, which was in the basement. Unfortunately, the basement was the only flight of steps below the lobby where I was headed. Also, the generator was not too far away from the stairwell that I was in. I made it down to the 4th floor, and suddenly I heard a door open at the bottom of the stairwell. I stopped dead in my tracks. At this point, I knew I was armed, but I was thinking to myself, even though I went through training, I don't think I was ready to shoot anyone. I was hoping and praying that it wouldn't come to that. As I was standing there, immersed in my thoughts about my training with my firearm, I started hearing heavy footsteps walking up the stairs. I wasted no time in coming up with a new plan. I was going to turn around and walk as quickly and quietly back up the steps as possible to the 6th floor where I came from. At the top of the steps, a few feet past the door, still in the stairwell, there's a ladder that leads up to the hatch that leads to the roof of the building. I was going to climb up the ladder to the top just before you have to open the hatch to go any further, and just hide in there in the pitch black darkness until whatever happens next. I turned around. Just as I did, my gun banged against the metal to the stairwell railing, making a loud clang sound. As that happened, I froze, and so did the heavy footsteps. A few seconds had gone by, and then I heard whoever it was running as fast as they could up the steps. I sprang as fast as I could, running up the steps as if my life depended on it. As I got to the top of the steps, just before I was about to pass the door I had come from, I had an idea to create a diversion on the fly. I quickly opened up the door hard and loud, then let go of the handle and let it close and slam on its own. I continued to run to the ladder and climb up it. By doing that, I would make it appear that I had run out the door. With only seconds to spare, I made it up the ladder. The man, distracted by the door tactic, opened it without even looking in my direction. He ran into the hall, the heavy door closing behind him. That's when I saw my chance. I leapt down from the ladder, only about 10 feet high, landing with a loud thud as my feet hit the floor. I bolted for the stairs. The man must have heard the sound, because I had barely made it down one flight before I heard the door open again and his footsteps pounding down after me. Both of us were sprinting as fast as we could. I managed to stay one floor ahead of him the entire way. When I reached the lobby, luck was suddenly on my side. Behind me, I heard a loud crashing noise followed by a cry of pain. I wasn't certain, but I think the man had tripped and fallen on the stairs. I wasn't about to wait around to confirm. I burst through the door, ran straight for the entrance, and used my key to unlock it. Fortunately, I always parked my truck close by. With the wind howling and the rain pouring down, I hit the fob to start the engine and unlock the doors as I sprinted across the lot. I jumped into the truck, threw it in reverse, and just then caught sight of him. Dressed all in black, his face covered by a mask and hood, bursting out of the building and charging toward my car. I slammed the gear into drive and floored it, tires screeching as I tore out of the lot and onto the side road. It wasn't until I was nearly at the main road that I got a signal on my phone. I immediately called the police. They arrived about 15 minutes later, and I followed them back to the building. I told them everything, filling out reports for both them and my company. We searched the entire building and surrounding area, but found nothing. The scariest part came when they checked the stairwell. Apparently, when the man had fallen, he dropped something. The police recovered a fully loaded, unregistered, semi-automatic handgun. To this day, no one knows why someone would have broken into that building. There was nothing particularly special about it, except that it was government property. Whatever the case, I'm just thankful that luck was on my side that night. I used to work nights as a security guard in a medium-sized corporate office building in New Jersey, and for the most part, the nights were boring, quiet, and uneventful, which is why what happened one night has stuck with me so vividly for years. It started around midnight, after the last employees had left the building and the lobby was empty except for me, just me and the glow of the security monitors. My job was simple: check cameras, make a couple of patrol rounds, log any incidents, and mostly just sit and watch for anything unusual. That night, I was going through my usual routine, scanning the screens for the elevators, the hallways, and the underground parking garage, when I noticed a figure moving between the cars on the lower garage feed, which immediately caught my attention because the lot should have been completely empty at this hour. Only people with 24-hour access could get in, and I knew no one had it at that moment. At first, I thought it might have been one of the late shift IT guys, or maybe a cleaning crew member, but it didn't make sense, since cleaning crews had left hours before and the guy wasn't carrying any equipment or wearing a uniform. He was wearing a long dark coat that looked a little oversized, and he wasn't heading to any particular car or toward the exit. He just moved slowly, weaving around the rows like he was inspecting the area or making sure no one was around, and something about the way he moved gave me the chills. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was off. I called the supervisor and explained what I was seeing, and he told me to stay at my post and keep an eye on the cameras, which I did, but my gut told me I needed to check it in person. So I grabbed my flashlight and headed down to the garage. The elevator ride was long, slow, and every floor that passed seemed to echo in the shaft, making me more on edge than I cared to admit. When the doors opened on the garage level, I scanned the lot with my flashlight, and it was empty. Completely quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every little creak of the building sound huge. I called out, "Hello, security here," but the echo returned empty, and I didn't hear any reply. I walked slowly down the rows of cars, shining the light into every dark corner, every space between vehicles, but there was nothing there. Not a single shadow, not a single person. My pulse was racing, and I started to doubt myself, thinking maybe the camera was malfunctioning, or maybe it had picked up a shadow that wasn't really there. So I went back upstairs to the lobby, trying to shake it off. But as soon as I sat back down and looked at the garage feed again, there he was, standing in the exact same spot, as if he hadn't moved since I'd been there. And now my stomach dropped, because I knew I had just been there, and there was no way he could have gotten back into the same spot unnoticed unless he had been watching me, or worse, waiting for me. I radioed my supervisor again, telling him I was going to keep watching the cameras, and he told me not to approach him unless absolutely necessary, which was easier said than done because I couldn't stop staring at him, and my mind was already running through every possible scenario. For the next 20 minutes, I watched him wander slowly toward the stairwell that led to the upper floors. He moved carefully, pausing, looking over his shoulder like he was checking for someone, and then disappeared from the camera just before reaching the door, which made my stomach knot. I checked every other feed, hallways, elevator lobbies, even the rooftop access, and there was nothing. No trace of him at all, which only made me feel worse because it was impossible for him to vanish that fast, and it gave me the sinking feeling that he had access to the building somehow, or he was hiding in a way that I couldn't see. I stayed at my desk, heart pounding, until the elevator dinged and opened in the lobby. Nobody was inside, but on the polished floor, I noticed wet footprints leading from the elevator out into the main lobby. Bare feet, which was wrong on so many levels because it was freezing outside, and he would have had to take his shoes off just to wander barefoot. I froze in my tracks, realizing that if he was inside the building now, he could be anywhere, and every unlocked office or storage room was a potential hiding spot. I called the local off-site patrol for backup and debated locking myself in the lobby. But something in me told me I needed to do a patrol and confirm the situation, which in retrospect was probably a mistake. I took the elevator to the 5th floor and started walking the hallway slowly, flashlight in hand, scanning every office door, checking for movement. Every creak of the building made me jump. Halfway down the hall, I saw one of the office doors slightly ajar, which shouldn't have been possible because it was always locked at night. I pushed it open with my flashlight, peering inside, but the room was empty except for a sleeping computer monitor and a chair pushed in under the desk. Nothing else. I stepped out into the hall again and froze because I heard the sound of footsteps on the tile behind me. Not mine. Heavy, wet, and uneven, moving fast towards me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I swung my flashlight around the hall, catching a glimpse of the dark coat at the end of the hallway. He wasn't running, but he was walking fast with a purpose, and it hit me that he had been following me the entire time, hiding just out of sight whenever I checked the cameras. I bolted, sprinting down the hall toward the stairwell, barely noticing the handrail slamming against my arm as I rushed past. The footsteps followed, close enough that I could hear them clearly now, echoing in the hall. And I realized I had no idea how he had gotten inside, no idea what he wanted, and the panic was almost suffocating. I dove into the stairwell, sliding down a few steps, and slammed the door behind me as the footsteps thundered on the floor above. Then they stopped abruptly, and I sat there shaking for several minutes, trying to catch my breath and convincing myself I had imagined it. But the sound of my own breathing and the echo of those steps made me feel insane. When the patrol finally arrived, I was pale, sweaty, and trembling. We walked the building together, floor by floor, room by room, and the garage was completely empty. No sign of the intruder, no footprints, nothing. And when we checked the cameras, the footage from the time he appeared had been overwritten or corrupted, leaving a gap in the recording that made my skin crawl even more. I quit that job within a month, partly because of the fear, and partly because I couldn't handle walking the hallways alone anymore, especially when the garage was empty and the wind outside made the building creak, because every shadow and every noise reminded me of him walking behind me, just out of sight, waiting. Even years later, I get anxious in parking garages or office buildings at night, and I still check over my shoulder more than I should, thinking I might see that long coat rounding a corner, hearing those wet footsteps behind me again. And I know that what I experienced wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a faceless ghost or a phantom. It was a real person, a stalker, and the thought that he had been inside that building following me, hiding just out of view, and that I might never know how he got in or what he wanted, is something that still haunts me every time I think about that night. This happened to me a few days ago. As a matter of fact, it was my first night of training as a mobile security guard. Before I tell you my story, just want to clarify that a mobile security guard is primarily a security guard that drives around in the vehicle and does site visitation where the client needs security. In this case, it's the GTA of Toronto, but this incident took place at a nearby pharmacy/medical clinic in Mississauga. It was my first night as a trainee, and my supervisor was a nice person, showing me around on how to conduct patrols, write reports, disarm fire alarms, etc. Usually, if an alarm occurs, dispatch notifies us through the radio and asks us to attend the site where the alarm is happening. However, we arrived at the medical clinic in Mississauga to conduct a regular perimeter patrol, which also meant there was no alarm. We arrived on the site around 1:15 a.m. to make sure everything was normal, but as we got out of the vehicle and approached the building, something was terribly wrong. For one, the underground parking garage was left open, and two, the front door of the building was busted open. My supervisor then said, "What the f***, how is this possible? If somebody broke in, the alarm should be on." I did not know how to react to this, as this was my first time at the site, and according to my supervisor, this was a new contract that the security company I work for got. We stepped in the building cautiously, but all of a sudden my supervisor says, "Look at the elevator. It's going up at different levels." Sure enough, he was not kidding, as the elevator was moving from G1, 2, 3, and stopped at level 4, which was the very top. I asked my supervisor if he thinks someone was in here. He immediately nods and pulls out his baton. At that very moment, I was feeling sick to my stomach and started breathing heavily. At that point, I hated my job and did not want to be there. We immediately went inside the elevator and went straight to the top level. I was getting a bad feeling, and some adrenaline was rushing through my body before the elevator door was about to open. As we were going up each level, I was thinking to myself, like, what if something happens, or whoever this person or thing is might not leave without a fight, and possibly even charge at us as the elevator door opens. However, luckily as we arrived at the 4th floor, no one was in front of us, but it was extremely dark. Therefore, we turned on the lights and started investigating the rooms of that floor. My supervisor told me to stick with him, as even he was feeling uncomfortable. He said, I quote, "Make sure you stick with me and get ready to bust this f." Luckily, no one was there, so we were very shocked and didn't know what was happening, until we heard footsteps going down the stairwell. My supervisor and I were about to open the door to the stairs and chase whoever it was inside. However, just then, the footsteps stopped and it was very quiet. We could only hear each other's breathing. What my supervisor said next to dispatch is something I will never forget and still is rattling around in my head. A4, call C25, go ahead. Dispatch, we need immediate backup. Please be advised someone's in the building with us and they're hiding downstairs, possibly armed and waiting for us to come towards them so he or they can ambush us. Dispatch then tells us to stay where we are and not approach the suspect or whoever it was downstairs, as backup will be arriving shortly. At that point, my supervisor started panicking, and it just made the situation even worse. I mean, he should be the one to lead and not feel worried. But then again, I don't blame him, as this experience was overwhelming and horrifying for me. Now, my supervisor is only a couple of years older than me, so I preferably call him bro instead of sir or whatever. Bro, just don't worry. I'm sure backup will be arriving shortly, I told him. You might be wondering why we could not hit the exit and run for it. Well, you see, the suspect is on the ground floor, which means he could be anywhere. So with the elevator making noises, he or she could be alarmed and immediately stand in front of the elevator blocking our way. The suspect could approach us by coming upstairs, but I guess that he or they figured we could attack him by surprise. So maybe that's why he was quietly waiting at the corner for us downstairs. 15 minutes later, we heard the door open. It was our senior supervisor, and his voice echoed out, "Security." My supervisor radioed him and said, "Sir, we're upstairs. Be careful, there's someone downstairs." A few minutes later, the senior supervisor met us upstairs and told us to come investigate with him. Therefore, we did. But we looked everywhere downstairs and then each floor and found no one. As we were at the third floor scanning each room and bathroom to see if the person was there, we heard the front door open and heard footsteps running outside. We were not fast enough to see who it was, because by the time we got to the ground floor, the suspect was gone. Both my supervisor and I were in shock because we looked everywhere and did not find anyone. Either that person was in a very good hiding spot, or that medical clinic center was haunted. I don't think I'll ever know. But this was by far the most horrific experience of my life, and coming this weekend, I'll be there again for site visitation, but this time alone, as I'll be trained by then. This happened a couple of years ago, right before school ended. It was the last day of 8th grade. It was exactly what you'd expect on the final day of middle school. Excitement and bittersweet goodbyes. Everyone was running around, scribbling signatures and cheesy messages in each other's yearbooks. My middle school was huge, easily over 1,000 students. So to keep things manageable, the teachers collected our yearbooks and passed them around to different classrooms, making sure everyone who wanted to got a chance to sign. I'm sure you could see how that could create problems. Anyone who wanted to could write whatever they wanted in anyone's yearbook. The teachers tried their best to prevent things from getting out of hand, but I knew a few kids who wrote some mean messages to people they didn't like. At the end of the day, when I got my yearbook back, I flipped through the pages eagerly, reading all the goofy notes from my friends. But as I scanned the pages, something caught my eye. There was a signature below the face of someone I had never seen before. His name was Samuel Robinson III, a name I'm going to remember for as long as I live. The message he wrote was short, simple, and honestly a bit unsettling. It read, "Hags, I'll be seeing you again." I stared at the page, confused out of my mind. I'd never even spoken a single word to this Samuel kid. It wasn't like there was anything I could do about it, though. The school year was over, so I couldn't see him even if I wanted to. I just chalked it up to some weird kid being weird, or maybe an honest mistake. Either way, I stopped thinking about it. A few hours passed, and before I knew it, I was at home hosting a sleepover in my basement with my best friends Kevin, David, and Kieran. The four of us ate Doritos and played Call of Duty all night. My parents' bedroom was 3 floors above us, so we didn't have to worry much about keeping the noise down. We were messing around on my dad's rowing machine sometime just before 2 when we heard a sharp knock at the storm door. The sound instantly silenced us. Who the hell would knock on the storm door? It must have been someone who either didn't want to wake my parents up or knew we were down there, or both. It didn't make sense. The person kept knocking in the same rhythmic pattern. I could tell Kieran was about to say something, and I couldn't stop him in time. In a loud and assertive voice, he asked who was there. I wanted to knock him out. He had basically broadcasted to whoever was out there that we were down there. My basement doesn't have any external windows, so it was unlikely that they had known we were down there, but now they did. After a long pause and no more knocking, a muffled voice answered back. He said, "Come around to the back door," in a high-pitched voice that genuinely sounded cheerful, like he was a friend of ours trying to join the sleepover. It was definitely a teenager's voice too, and it didn't sound like someone who was pretending to raise their voice either. I was pretty scared, I can't lie. My friends were seemingly unfazed though, like they thought it was somehow exciting that some random kid was outside my house. They insisted that I at least check it out, and even though I didn't want to, they pressured me into it. We crept upstairs, careful not to make too much noise. I approached the back door slowly, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. Through the narrow glass pane beside it, I could see a shadowy figure standing under the dim light. I got a little closer, and his face came into view. My jaw nearly hit the floor when I realized who it was. It was him. It was that kid Samuel Robinson III who had signed my yearbook. My friends went to go open the door, God knows why, but I stopped them, saying I knew who it was. I explained to them what had happened, and that changed their mood a bit. Keep in mind, Sam was still standing outside while we were talking, and he could definitely see in at us. He must have noticed how freaked out I was, because he started motioning to the side of the house like he wanted me to go over to the window. You might be wondering why none of us were taking the situation more seriously. I honestly think it was because it wasn't like some older, strange man was harassing us. It was a kid from our own school. Still, I wasn't opening the door for him. Instead, I went over to my kitchen window and cracked it open just a tiny bit. My friends followed me and stood a little off to the side. He walked over to the window and I asked him what he wanted, telling him I recognized him from our yearbook. He said, "Oh, so you got my message," and introduced himself as Sam. Then he went on to say he always watched me from afar and that we could have been good friends. I agreed with him just so that I wouldn't piss him off, but there was 0% chance I would have been friends with this kid given any circumstances. I didn't want to press him right away, but I had to know, so I asked him how he knew where I lived. He didn't respond, and I didn't know what to say. Before I could de-escalate the situation, David called him a creepy stalker and told him to piss off. Sam's smile disappeared. He tilted his head like he didn't understand what David had just said. Then, just as quickly, his expression twisted into something I can only describe as hatred. He went from passive and honestly kind of friendly to aggressive and angry. He started screaming things at me, how he hated my friends and thought we should all die, how my ex hated me and random stuff he had no right knowing. He reached toward the window and tried to force it open, but I jammed it shut and locked it. He started snarling at the window and banging on it like an animal. He was 2 seconds away from shattering it, I'm telling you. We must have caused quite the commotion because my parents came rushing down the stairs, demanding to know why we had woken them up. That's when Sam ran away. I told my parents what happened as quickly as I could, and my dad raced outside in his underwear. He came back a few minutes later, saying he had no idea where the kid went. I'm not sure why, but my parents didn't call the police. They just told us to go back to sleep and they'd deal with the school the following morning, just to give the kid the benefit of the doubt. The next morning, they contacted the school. That's when we learned the disturbing truth. Sam had been expelled a few weeks before the year finished, and he shouldn't have ever been at the school on the last day. Apparently, the yearbooks were printed before his expulsion, which explained why his picture was still included. That meant he had snuck into the school somehow just to write me that message, which freaked me out beyond belief. Despite working with the school to find out more, nobody could track Sam down. It was like he and his parents didn't exist. The whole thing was a pretty big deal, but the school did what they could to keep things under wraps. To this day, I still have no idea how he knew where I lived. That's what freaks me out the most. The running theory is that he was a mentally challenged and troubled young boy who took a strange liking to me for whatever reason, and then he stalked me for who knows how long. My parents were worried for weeks. It's something we don't talk about anymore because it's just uncomfortable, but living in that same house has never felt the same ever since. My friend Garrett is a little unhinged, and when I say a little, I mean a lot. He's one of those guys that goes around boasting about how crazy and aggressive he is like it's cool or something. He's constantly getting into fights, doesn't know how to keep his mouth shut, and spends more time in the gym than anywhere else, including his own house. There are actually 5 stories about him I could choose to tell, but the scariest one by far is the one you're about to hear. It also directly involves me, and I feel much more comfortable telling my own story rather than someone else's. This happened a couple of weeks ago, which was also coincidentally the last day of senior year, May 2019. The graduation ceremony wasn't scheduled for a few days, so even though we were done, we still had to stick around. It's tradition for all the graduating seniors to get plastered on the last day of classes, so that's exactly what we did. There's this huge clock tower in the center of campus where all the seniors convene to get drunk, which is exactly where we were at 10 p.m. It was packed. There were over 1,000 people crammed into that one courtyard. It was bittersweet, for me at least, but I think everyone was relieved at having finished finals, which are pretty tough at my school. There are a handful of other senior traditions I could tell you about, but I'm going to try to keep things succinct. There were 6 of us. It was me, C, T, R, N, and obviously Garrett. I don't think the rest of my friends would be comfortable with their names out there, so I'm just calling them by their initials. I should also really quickly mention that we lived off campus, meaning we had to walk through the city to get home. There are a decent amount of homeless people in that city, so it's not rare to encounter some of them late at night. Anyway, we were heading back home from the clock tower when Garrett did some Garrett stuff. Well, it wasn't really his fault, but that's neither here nor there. As we were crossing the street, some random homeless guy ran up to our group and started tweaking. Usually, the homeless people around here keep to themselves since they're all tripping on drugs and didn't notice their own surroundings. But this guy clearly wanted to engage. He was just standing in the middle of the crosswalk, yelling things at us like he was a bridge troll protecting the other side of the street. We laughed a little and started walking in a wide semicircle around him, as we didn't want to piss him off or antagonize him. Well, everyone but Garrett, that is. Instead of disengaging, Garrett started yelling things back at the guy, telling him to get the F out of the street and to stop harassing strangers. The tweaker didn't like that and took a few aggressive steps toward him. That's when the rest of us jumped in to prevent an altercation from happening. We must have intimidated the tweaker because he stopped charging and went back to just yelling things. I pulled Garrett out of the street, trying to get him to behave, but he pushed my hand away. Before any of us could do anything, he charged full speed at the tweaker and screamed, "I'm crazy." The tweaker started running away, which caused Garrett to stop charging and start laughing. I know it's bad, but the scene was genuinely funny, as messed up as it was. It was like running full speed into a flock of birds and watching them scatter. We started walking towards our house after that, but after a few minutes, we realized the tweaker was following us. When he caught us looking back at him, he started yelling things about how we had made a big mistake and how he was going to, quote, call a niche, whatever that meant. We started heckling the guy back, hoping he'd get scared and leave, but I'm pretty sure we only intensified whatever tantrum he was having. Look, I'm not proud of everything that happened that night, but we were about to graduate from a very prestigious university and had been celebrating all night with alcohol, so we weren't in the right headspace to properly evaluate the situation. About a block away from our house, we realized the guy was still following, albeit a little further back now. I told the rest of the guys I didn't feel comfortable leading him to our house, and the other guys agreed. So naturally, Garrett took off toward the homeless guy before the group could come to a consensus. He again started sprinting at the guy, who once again fled in the opposite direction. Garrett turned and jogged back towards us, and we all jogged up the street. We thought that was it. We made it back to our house, pretty confident we hadn't been followed that time. I'm not even going to go into what we did back at the house. Let's just say it was a level of degeneracy I won't be approaching anytime soon. I can't even tell you what time it was. I was stumbling out of the front door to pick up my DoorDash when I noticed something odd. The side gate that led into our backyard was wide open. It was especially weird because we used this little strand of twine to keep it shut, so the door being open meant that someone had deliberately undone it. I instantly made the connection. It was probably that guy from earlier. I had enough sense to connect the dots, but I guess I didn't have enough sense to react accordingly. The smart thing would have been to alert my friends, but my drunken self decided to investigate. I put the DoorDash on the porch and went around the house, trying my best to walk straight. I turned the corner into the backyard, and before I could even see, I felt a rope around my throat. I flailed around wildly, but it was no use. Someone was strangling me from behind, and there was nothing I could do about it. I felt the rope's frayed ends digging into my throat as he tightened it with all his strength. I genuinely thought I was going to die. With all my might, I swung my legs backward, and he lost his footing. The two of us hit the ground, and I could breathe again, but he was still on top of me. In a fit of rage, he clawed at my face, and I could feel blood streaming down my cheeks. I threw him off of me, and he got to his feet before running out of sight. I'll try and keep things short from here on out. I ended up having to go to the hospital that night. The cuts weren't bad, but I needed a bunch of shots to protect me against any kind of diseases the guy might have had. The police were less than helpful, and since I was moving out a week later, there wasn't much I could do either. The worst part about the whole thing was that I had visible cuts in all my grad photos. Garrett felt so bad he ended up taking me to Nobu, but I never held anything against him. I just hope he's learned his lesson about not antagonizing people who have nothing to lose. When I was in the 7th grade, there was this kid named Sven in my homeroom. To put it mildly, he was a bit strange. He was one of those kids who didn't socialize with anyone else, even though people frequently tried to include him in things. I didn't have all my classes with him, but from what I remember, he would always sit in the same spot in every room, the back corner opposite the door. Without fail, he'd show up to school in the exact same outfit every day, cargo shorts and an oversized burgundy hoodie. He obviously didn't talk much, but when he did have to answer a question or read a passage, he had a really deep voice that lots of other kids made fun of him for. I don't recall him having any friends at all, which made sense. This one time, my friend Tyler caught him slicing worms during recess, which I'm pretty sure he ended up getting detention for. Speaking of recess, Sven would spend the whole period by himself next to the fence that bordered the woods. He never played any games or did anything even remotely kid-centric. He'd just stand next to that fence doing God knows what. Some of my friends claim to have seen him talking to someone on the other side, but I've personally never seen that, so I'm not going to spread potential lies. I'm trying to think of other things about him worth mentioning. He had several quirks and some other weird habits typical of any strange middle schooler, but none relevant to the story I'm going to tell. This happened on the last day of school. I went to a pretty big middle school with lots of kids per grade, meaning there were a ton of concurrent classes with students from the same year happening at all times. Because of that, there was this last day of school tradition where students from the same year would sneak into and sit in random classrooms to try and mess with the teachers. I'm pretty sure the teachers were privy to this and played along to amuse the kids, but that's neither here nor there. I don't remember the exact time this happened, but I do remember I was in one of the few classes I shared with Sven. Everything was exactly as it had been all day. The entire class was mixed up with random students that were supposed to be elsewhere. I was kind of a stickler for rules growing up. That's just how I was raised, so I never participated in any of the tomfoolery. My friends all did though, so I was often alone in all of my classes since they went to other rooms together. This was one of those times. All my friends had left the room, and the only kid I knew even a little, coincidentally, was Sven. Sven was acting stranger than usual that day. That's something I remember distinctly. I can't fully remember what we were learning or doing in class, but I do remember that Sven was tapping his foot pretty aggressively, something he never did. He was also constantly looking around the room, as if searching for someone or trying to keep tabs on someone. I don't think he was watching me, but I couldn't be sure. The other thing I remember was that there were a lot more kids in the class I didn't recognize. Granted, one or two wasn't anything out of the ordinary since everything was switched around, but the odds that there were so many students I had never even seen before were slim. At some point, the teacher, I'm pretty sure her name was Miss Bell, told us to get into groups of 3 or 4 to work on some kind of end-of-year reflection worksheet. Nothing serious. Most kids just used it as an excuse to talk and mess around. At one point, Miss Bell walked over to her desk, picked up the classroom phone, and turned her back to us. A few minutes later, another teacher showed up, I think from the room next door. They stepped just outside the classroom door and started whispering. It wasn't a long conversation, maybe half a minute, but something about it felt off, like they were trying not to cause a scene. I could tell something was up. Miss Bell looked uneasy. That's honestly the best way I can describe her demeanor. After they finished talking, Miss Bell and the other teacher came back into the room. They didn't say anything to the class. They just walked over to a few specific kids and knelt down beside their desks. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but whatever it was quiet, clearly like they didn't want the rest of us to notice. A minute later, those same kids got up and followed the teachers into the hallway. No one really reacted. I felt like I was the only one who even noticed what was going on. Miss Bell came back a few minutes later, alone this time. She didn't say anything about the kids who left, just sat back down at her desk and started shuffling papers like nothing had happened. But right after she did, the fire alarm went off. Miss Bell didn't really react, like she knew it was going to happen. She told us to line up and head outside, and we joined the rest of the school out by the field behind the building. As usual, everyone was grouped by homeroom, so I ended up standing with a bunch of familiar faces again. But while we were all standing there, I looked back at the school for no reason, just out of habit I guess, and I could have sworn I saw something move in one of the second-story windows. It was quick, and maybe it was just a reflection or a shadow or something, but it felt wrong. The school was supposed to be completely empty. I kept it to myself, but I was really scared when it came to re-entering the building. We never went back inside though. Before the alarm even stopped ringing, we started hearing sirens. A few minutes later, police cars started pulling into the lot. Not just 1 or 2, but a whole line of them. They didn't waste time either. Officers jumped out and rushed straight into the building. No one explained anything. Teachers just told us to stay calm and wait. After a while, someone came around and said school was being let out early. No buses, we had to call our parents. We were never told what actually happened. My parents ended up telling me what happened, or at least what the school had told them. They told me that a bunch of kids who didn't even go to our school had somehow gotten in. A rumor went around that they were planning to set the place on fire. Apparently, Miss Bell had discovered some very alarming tools in one of the kids' backpacks, and the school tried flushing everyone out with the fire drill. The details are still a bit fuzzy, so I'm hoping I'm explaining everything properly. The part that really stuck with me was what my mom said at the end, that the kids had been let in by Sven through the side fence during recess. The whole thing was so bizarre, it's still difficult to process even now. I never saw Sven again.
This happened when I was 15 years old. My best friend Anthony wanted me to come over for the night since his parents would be gone all weekend. I rode my bike over and put it in his backyard before letting myself in through his back door. We played basically every video game he had, from FIFA all the way to Call of Duty, with popcorn and other junk food spilled out all over the floor. As the night progressed, we moved from video games to watching half a movie and getting bored to doing prank calls at close to 10 o'clock. Anthony made a few calls to different pizza places. When it was my turn, I just dialed a few random numbers in hopes to get someone at their house. On, say, my 4th attempt, I finally reached somebody. A guy with a deep and rough voice picked up, answering with a yeah instead of a hello. Anthony's laughing in the background made me stumble with my words mid-sentence, ultimately cracking up into laughter. I had never done a prank call, so I sucked at it. The guy on the other end was silent. I regained a straight face and tried to continue with the call. It went something like this. Sir, would it be alright if I borrowed one of the wheels from your car? What's your name, kid? My name is Bob. Really? You sure it's not Anthony? It hit me like a brick. I looked up at Anthony, whose face was noticeably full of fear. I hung up the phone, not wanting to be on the line with whoever that was for another second. Anthony, who the hell was that? I asked him. I don't know, he told me. Does your caller ID info display your name or something? No, it shows my dad's name. We hopped on the computer and did some research, trying to figure out how it was possible to get someone's name through their phone number. It didn't make sense how he could get Anthony's name so quickly. He was way too young at the time to be on any of those personal information sharing websites. We ended up asking a question on Yahoo Answers, since no one had a similar experience. The question turned up no answers. I suggested he call his dad, but he said he wasn't supposed to have anybody over for the weekend, so he didn't want to call. We planned on sleeping in the living room, so we just resumed watching the movie that we hadn't finished from earlier. Right after the phone call had left my mind, me and Anthony looked at each other when we heard his front storm door opening, and then the doorknob to the front door began to turn. It only was able to turn about halfway before the lock restricted it. Anthony turned off the TV, and I went over to the window to see who it was. I spread the blinds open. There was a tall guy standing outside. He noticed the blinds moving and turned to look at me. I practically threw the blinds back into place. Me and Anthony hid in the kitchen, listening for any more noises. We heard the sound of the gate to the backyard opening, as it was right outside the kitchen window. "God damn it," I said. "I forgot to shut the back door." Anthony urged me to run and shut it. I made it to the hallway leading to his back door, and froze. There was a silhouette standing outside the back door. I don't think he noticed me, but he was surely looking into the house. He opened the door and stepped inside. I tiptoed to the kitchen and motioned for Anthony to follow me upstairs. We made it to his room as quietly as possible, pulling the door shut to avoid making any noise. We crawled under his bed. He had cloth covering the bottom of his bed, so you couldn't see anything under it unless you actually moved the cloth. The doors downstairs all opened, each one getting closer to the stairs. Thumps finally began up the stairs, and he was right outside the door now. The door to the room opened. I could hear Anthony's breathing. It was too loud. Footsteps moved over to the closet, and then the closet opened. I could hear the coat hangers being slid around as the fabric of the jackets and coats rubbed against each other. Footsteps moved over to the bed and stopped. I felt like my heart was about to explode out of my chest. Anthony's breathing was too loud. I had to cover his mouth with my hand. Nothing but silence in the room now. We laid still for so long, I almost thought he wasn't even in the room anymore. I moved my hand away from Anthony's mouth and whispered in his ear, "You think we can make a run for it?" He was about to answer when the most disturbing, memory-haunting scream I'd ever heard filled my ears as Anthony was seemingly dragged out from under the bed. I crawled out and saw him struggling with the man. I desperately looked around for anything to use as a weapon. I settled with the screwdriver sitting on his nightstand. I hurried over to the man and drove the screwdriver into his back. He let go of Anthony as he let out a scream of agony, giving us time to get the hell out of the house. Running onto the road would give away our position too easily. It would take too long to make it to his neighbor's house. We dove for the tree line in the woods and took cover behind a bush, watching the house. The back door opened as the man stepped outside, looking around the backyard. He then looked out to the woods. I felt his eyes pass me as he scanned through the tree line. It seemed that it was too dark for him to see us. Then, he turned his head back in our direction. I ducked behind the bush. "Joe, he's coming." "What?" "Dude, get up, we gotta run." He was right. The man was approaching us fast. How could he have seen us? We ran through the woods with the leaves crunching under us, giving away our position. When Anthony tripped over something, I crouched down with him, hoping we had run far enough. Not even 20 seconds later, oncoming footsteps from the direction we were running from came fast. They slowed down only 2 trees away from us, as we lay face down in the leaves. Moments later, the footsteps take off in another direction. We waited until we could no longer hear them, and took off back in the direction of the house. While running, over the sound of leaves crushing and my heavy breathing, I could swear I heard leaves crushing from behind us. We made it back to his backyard, into his house, and this time remembering to shut the back door. We were now able to call the police. Anthony stayed on the line with them, while I patrolled the back windows, making sure nobody was out there. It was so dark though, I couldn't see anything. So I did something that seems stupid today. I turned on his backyard lights, and immediately in the distance, over by the woods, I saw him, standing in front of a big tree. He turned off back into the woods and disappeared out of sight. That was the last time me or Anthony ever saw him. I would be lying if I told you we heard the occasional knocks at our windows or something cliche. No, that was it. 5 years have passed and nothing has happened. Do I wonder if it was somehow linked to the prank call? Maybe. Does it make sense? Not really. But yeah, this was the story of how me and my still best friend Anthony almost died during a break-in. Me and my wife have had our fair share of arguments, but there was this one night that she wouldn't stop bitching over the stupidest shit. It got to the point where I forgot to put the toilet seat down, and she lectured me at the top of her lungs with an ear-piercing voice that I just couldn't take it anymore. I called my buddy Paul up, and he told me I could crash there for the night. I was exhausted, and I didn't need to deal with my crazy wife at the time. Paul had a huge house, which was another thing my wife always yelled at me about, how all my friends have nicer houses than us. We had a few beers and had a bro chat. He suggested I stay there for as long as I needed, but I assured him I'd only stay for one night. I didn't want to be a bother. I slept in one of his guest bedrooms. Surprisingly, he has 3 guest bedrooms, but has only needed to use one of them so far. He never uses the other 2 bedrooms, and only plans on using them for a party or something like that. All 3 guest bedrooms in the house are lined up next to each other, while Paul's bedroom is across the hall. It's a weird setup for sure, but it let me hear strange noises coming from the next room over. I assumed it was Paul doing something in there, but it quickly got annoying, so I decided to just walk over and see what was going on. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. I cracked the door open to Paul's room and asked him what the noise was. He was already in bed as well. He didn't hear anything. Upon asking why he kept the door locked, he told me he always keeps those 2 doors locked as he keeps some personal belongings in there. I warned him that there was a strange noise coming from the room, and he told me to just go back to sleep, and if I continued to hear it, come back to him. So I did. I went back to bed, and the noises were completely gone now. A half hour passed. I was starting to drift off to sleep at last, when I heard the slightest tap on the wall. It came from the other side, the next room over. It was followed by a faint voice. I jolted up from the bed and ran back to Paul's room. This time, he took me seriously. He got the key to the 2 doors and unlocked the one next to mine. We stepped inside and felt a breeze hit us on the way in. The window was completely open, along with the closet. We dug through the entire room. The bed had marks on it as if someone were on it. The closet was full of empty bags, and his valuable belongings that were in his drawers were gone. Paul suddenly ran out to the hallway. I was confused at first, but I caught on quickly as he was checking the other room. I was right by his side as he unlocked the door to the 3rd guest bedroom, and the first thing we saw was a black figure jumping out the window onto the patio roof. Paul was about to jump out after him, but we instead both ran outside through the back door in hopes to catch him. He was gone already. It's a good thing we didn't catch him though, because what we found in this room was far more disturbing. The white sheets on the bed were stained with blood. The closet had the butcher knife he had been missing sitting on the floor with a few blood spots on it. And of course, all of his valuable belongings were gone. These people, most likely homeless and likely dangerous drug addicts, were living in his home for a little more than a week. He had even mentioned something about how fast his food goes, and yet he's so skinny when we were drinking. That made a lot more sense now. As far as we know, none of them were ever caught. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was my first sleepover, an important part of my childhood. It was my good friend. His name was Jordan. We were 10 years old. He had a huge basement where we could play video games until 1 in the morning and then sleep on the couches. Skipping the teeth brushing like two little rebels, we went straight to trying to get some sleep on the couches. I fell asleep with ease. I woke up at some unknown time. I realized the TV was still on, with a blank screen. It was giving off a very dim light, but it was enough to notice something in the far corner of the basement by the stairs. It was some tall object. I didn't know what it was, and I can't really describe how it looked. All I know is it almost reached the ceiling. The sound of the TV turning off and the small amount of light vanishing was almost enough to make me start screaming. I shut my eyes and just laid there motionless. I don't even remember falling back asleep. All I remember is waking up to a sudden and horrid screaming coming from upstairs. It was Jordan's mom. He woke up as well, and we looked at each other before sprinting upstairs to his parents' room. His mom was sitting there crying as his dad was turning the room upside down looking for what she saw. He barged out past us looking for anybody in the house, but there was nobody in the house. No signs of entry or exit. I'm still friends with Jordan today, and the last time I've brought this up, he said his mom doesn't like to talk about it, but she did once admit she saw a tall, dark figure standing by their bedroom door. I'm undoubtedly sure that's what I saw in the basement that night.
It was early June 2017. I was taking a road trip with my 9-year-old son Tom to West Virginia to visit family. It was a long, stressful drive. My car didn't have working AC at the time, and it was an incredibly hot day, so we were a bit stressed out by the 6-hour mark. We had left later in the day, so we were still on the road by dark. I think it was around 9 p.m. when we were still on the interstate, and Tom started complaining that he needed to use the bathroom. There was already tension in the car before this, but his constant complaining brought about a slight argument between the two of us. It was about personal stuff I'd rather not share with the internet. At last, I saw a blue rest area sign zoom past us on the interstate, so I veered off into the rest area. It had a small building with 2 bathrooms, a couple vending machines, and a few benches. That was it. There were no other cars parked nearby besides some big white pickup truck. As I pulled up next to the building, Tom got out in a hurry and ran to the bathroom. I left the car on because I knew he'd be back soon. Like I said, I don't want to get into personal stuff, like why we had a bit of an argument, but it seemed we were at that stage where we weren't exchanging words anymore. I figured the rest of the ride would be silent. About a minute later, the back door opened and then shut. I wanted to say something to Tom, but I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed quiet and drove off. I noticed that the white pickup truck parked nearby was leaving as well. In fact, he was close behind me. I veered back onto the interstate and into the left lane, and the pickup truck did the same. I stepped on it a little, and so did he. He started flashing his lights, so I switched to the right lane, thinking he was nothing but an aggressive driver. But as soon as I switched to the right, so did he. He was still flashing his lights. I pulled into the right lane and started to slow down. He sped up, still in the middle lane, and when he caught up to me, he slowed down and lowered his window. I did the same, and he started yelling something to me, pointing at my car. He looked like a creepy, sketchy dude at first glance. I couldn't hear a word he was saying, so he pointed for me to pull over to the side. I told Tom to keep calm. In my head, I was saying if this guy tried to do anything funny, I would floor it. The pickup pulled up behind me on the grass, and the guy came out of his truck running to my car. I put the car back in drive as my heart was racing, ready to drive. But then he screamed, "Wait." He got to my window and said, "That's not your kid," and pointed to the back seat. As he said this, I was confused and said, "What?" He said, "That's not your kid that got in your car." Suddenly, the back right side door opened, and I turned to see someone getting out of my car, not my son Tom. I got out from the car, screaming at the tall person who seemed to be a fully grown man, but they had already disappeared into the woods. I looked at the driver of the pickup and thanked him as I suddenly panicked, thinking about what could have happened to Tom. I got back in my car, crossed the grass between the interstate, and drove back to the rest area. The guy in the pickup followed me. We got back there in like 30 seconds to find Tom waiting outside the rest area bathroom. He got back in the car, all confused. I explained everything to him, almost out of breath, as did the pickup driver. I thanked the guy one more time before he drove back to the spot he was sitting in before. Tom was so intrigued about what just happened, and I was so disturbed that we were back on good terms again. We chatted the whole rest of the way and told family about it as soon as we arrived. I never even got to see what the person who got in my car looked like. Honestly, maybe I should be happy I never turned around to look at them, because I don't know what they would have done. My girlfriend and I took a road trip to California recently. The way there was completely normal. We left home early in the morning and got to the hotel by nightfall. On our way back home, however, we left midday and a majority of our ride was in the dark. The drive was about 10 hours each way, not including stops for food. We made 2 food stops, the first after about 3 hours of driving, then one more much later and deeper into the night. We got off the freeway at like 12:30 at night and went to the nearest Wendy's for food. We got right back on the freeway after that. I ate while I drove, which my girlfriend wasn't too fond of, but I just wanted to get home sooner rather than later. Shortly after getting back on the freeway, it started to rain. My girlfriend forced me to pull over now. She didn't want me eating and driving in poor conditions. As I pulled to the side, it actually started to downpour. I finished up eating my food, and then we heard a bang sound at the window. At first, I chalked it up to noises from the storm, but when I looked to my left out the window to see a figure blocking 90% of the window, along with a shriek of my girlfriend's, I nearly had a heart attack. I didn't want to roll down the window given how hard it was pouring, but over the sound of the torrential rain pounding on the car, I couldn't hear what the person was saying. I opened the door a crack and yelled out to the person, who turned out to be a woman. She was soaked already and looked disheveled and scared. She asked for a ride, and what was I going to do? Tell her no in these conditions? I told her to get in the back seat. My girlfriend gave me a look. I don't know what kind of look exactly, but it looks kind of like a "why the hell did you let her in" kind of look. I asked the woman where she was heading. She didn't answer. I caught my girlfriend giving me a look again because of this. I ignored her and turned around to look at the woman in the back seat, assuming she didn't hear me. But as creepy as it was, she was actually looking right at me with a cold, unfriendly face. I'd say it was a neutral, blank face, but something about it was just off-putting. I repeated my question, and she just shrugged her shoulders and laughed. I looked at my girlfriend, who was once again looking at me. I said out loud that I'd be dropping the woman off at the next town we crossed. I guess I was announcing that to both my girlfriends and the woman. As we got back onto the barren highway, there was a sudden ear-piercing screaming sound coming from right behind me, and the woman sitting behind me suddenly wrapped her arms around my throat. I slammed on the brakes as I was struggling to breathe, almost sliding into the divider. My girlfriend, quote, slashed at the woman's face with her long nails. The screaming turned from a deranged, angry kind of screaming to screams of pain and agony. I got out of the car as she had her hands pressed up against her face in agony. I then opened the back door, grabbed the woman with both hands, and literally threw her out of the car into the rain. She started begging, "Please, please," over and over as I looked down at her. But that's all she said. She cried as she kept saying the word "please." I ignored her and got back into my car and locked it. As I put the car in drive, there were bangs at the window as the woman started screaming again. Her screams once again sounded like the screams of a deranged mental asylum patient. I drove away casually, as she was no longer a real threat, or at least not that I knew of. My girlfriend quickly got on the phone with the police and warned them of some suspicious, unstable woman lurking around the highway. We didn't stop again, though. We went straight home from there, obviously a bit shaken up and whatnot, but I didn't want to be thinking about that incident for any longer than I had to. It was 2010. I was driving my Ford F-150 from my home in Pennsylvania to Georgia. I had family in the countryside of Georgia who I'd be spending the week with. It was going to be a drive of around 14 hours, and I planned on doing it all in one day. I got on the road at 10 a.m. I stopped once for lunch at some deli, and then 4 hours later I stopped at a rest area to eat the turkey sandwiches I packed in the cooler. After that, I didn't intend on making any other stops, besides for gas one more time, of course. At about 11:30 p.m., I had just filled up the tank one more time, and now I had an ETA of about 12:30. I was admittedly getting very tired now. I didn't think to get coffee at the gas station for some reason. The route the GPS was taking me down from the gas station seemed a little odd. I wasn't on the highway anymore. It was just taking me down some country-ass side roads. My truck is high up, so I got a good view of everything, and I also had a light bar installed, which really helped in lighting up these pitch-black roads. I was so tired, and I knew I shouldn't have been driving anymore, but I was so close to my cousin's house that I had to keep going. I came to a stop sign and made a left turn off some quiet road onto an even quieter road. The speed limit on this road was 45 though, which was good. This road was empty of any kinds of buildings or houses. It was just woodland on either side. I was going like 55 to 60 miles per hour, blazing down this road since it really seemed like no other cars would be on this type of road at this hour. Then suddenly I saw like 4 shiny objects coming up fast in the road ahead of me. I slammed on the brakes, and as I got closer, I figured out what they were. They were traffic drums, like those big cylinder traffic cones. My truck managed to come to a halt before I rammed into the drums. I got out of my truck with my baseball bat, confused as hell. I went over to the traffic drums and realized there was something else behind the traffic drums. It was a spike trap, like the kind police use. I didn't know what to think. Was there some kind of police activity going on? Or did somebody set this up as a trap? I cautiously looked all around me as I inched back to my truck. Then I heard someone scream help. It came from the woods on the left side of the road. There was no way I was about to go into those woods. The most I was willing to do was call out, "What's wrong?" No answer. I walked to the edge of the road and looked into the forest. The only reason I could see anything was because of the lights from my truck. In the corner of my eye, I spotted him. Without looking directly at him, I saw someone crouched down behind a couple bushes. I didn't run. I just casually walked back to my car. When I got in and shut the door, I looked to my left to see 2 silhouettes by the edge of the woods on the side of the road, walking towards my truck. I drove the truck to the right side of the road onto the dirt and past the spike trap. I don't think they anticipated me actually going around, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw at least 3 silhouettes standing by the traffic drums, lit up only briefly by the taillights of my truck. A few seconds later, they were gone out of my vision and out of my life forever. This was not something I would have ever expected to happen to me. Nevertheless, I'm glad I made it out alive. Number 3.
My dad has been an MTA Transit subway station manager for 35 years. With this job, there has to be a manager on duty at all times, so he's practically done every single possible shift throughout his career. That means he's done his fair share of night shifts. Most trains were completely empty throughout the night. He said it was the only nice part about doing the night shift. He has a series of funny and weird night shift stories to tell, but there's one downright horrifying one. My dad had just boarded the train to move to his office at another station. He was alone when he got on, which was at about 3 in the morning. At the next station, someone boarded. My dad describes him as a white, tall and skinny man wearing a heavy jacket and beanie. He shot my dad a quick glance before sitting in the furthest corner away from him. My dad said that he felt uncomfortable as the guy kept looking up at him every so often. When my dad's stop came, he got off, as well as the other man. He walked to his office door, unlocked it, and looked behind him. The man in the jacket was pacing around only about 50 feet away. My dad stepped into his office, shut the door, locked it, and sat at his desk. 5 minutes later, someone started to try and turn the doorknob. After the person on the other side of the door realized it was locked, they started to knock softly. My dad called out, "Who is it?" And they responded, "I want to talk." He told whoever it was to go away. He says he knew trouble when he saw it. He had a good feeling it was the guy from the train, as this station at a time like this was apparently always completely empty. My dad told the guy to go away. He continued to knock for a good 5 minutes. My dad finally pulled up the security camera screens and brought up the camera pointed to his office door. Sure enough, there was the guy from the train, wearing the jacket and beanie. Coincidentally, as soon as my dad brought up the camera, the man walked away. So my dad did whatever his work consisted of for about half an hour in that office. Before leaving to catch the next train, he checked the camera to make sure that the weird guy wasn't out there. He locked up and walked down the stairs to the train platform, where he got on the train right away. Looking out the window, he saw the guy from before walking down the stairs to the platform, and then stepping on the train into the same car as my dad. He sat down on the opposite side, a few seats to the right. My dad tried to look away and pretend not to notice him, but he knew the guy was staring at him. He at one point gave in and stared back, giving a slight nod and smile in some sort of truce attempt before looking away again. The man stared at my dad the whole ride to the next station, but my dad never looked back at him once after the first time. Now you may be asking, why didn't he try to forcibly get the guy to back off? Well, despite my dad's intimidating size, he's always been a complete teddy bear, no bark and no bite. Plus, he says he feared that that guy was armed and that one small motion could lead to death. When the train stopped at the station, my dad practically ran all the way back up to the streets, constantly glancing over his shoulder, and yes, the man from the train was following him. My dad had to find the first public building still open to try and escape. He found a Wendy's that was open and stepped inside. He sat and watched as the guy following him walked up to the window, stopped, and stared my dad down through the glass for about 10 seconds before turning around and walking across the street and then down the sidewalks. My dad said he ate, waited a little longer, then left the Wendy's to get to his third and final station for the night. The scariest part, when my dad was in his third office, as he was checking the security cameras out of the paranoia of the situation, he caught the guy from the train pacing around the outside, only about 30 feet from his office. He then stopped, looked up at the camera, and according to my dad, literally froze and stared for no less than a minute. When he finally lowered his head, he walked away out of the station to never be seen by my dad again. My dad doesn't know if he was followed after leaving the Wendy's, but that would only make sense. The guy was clearly disturbed, possibly homeless and or dangerous, and who knows what he actually wanted with my dad. Number 2. Me and my 3 friends were in New York around Christmas time. We didn't finally decide to leave until about maybe 2 in the morning. We got on the first train that we could catch, and as expected, it was empty. We were pretty sobered up by then. Then there was a sudden commotion in the next car over. We had peeked through the glass in between the cars, and there were two hooded men, or maybe teenagers, standing obnoxiously close to a woman sitting in one of the seats who was screaming for help. I suggested that we go over and kick their asses, but as me and a buddy got a closer look, we saw they were armed with handguns. I pushed all my friends to get to the next car over, away from the armed men. I took a look back and saw one of the men pointing at us before starting to follow. We ran through at least 3 different cars with the men following us before the train finally stopped at the next station. We all booked it through the old station to the nearest place we could hide. I got separated from my friends, so I went to hide behind a garbage can. I could hear my chaser's shoes hitting the tiled floors, so I knew I had no time to find a better hiding spot. I peeked through the opening at the top of the bin. I could get a better look at them now. One was black, the other was Indian, and they were both really young looking. I was sure they were only trying to rob us, until I heard one of them say, "If you find them, kill them." I hope you understand why I almost gave away my position in reaction to hearing this. With a gasp and almost pulling the garbage bin down with me as I returned to cover, I consider it a miracle neither of them caught me. They left the area. I took notice that they didn't have their guns drawn at that moment. I ran in the opposite direction of the two and quickly caught my friends who were waving me over from behind a large pole. I took cover with them behind another pole not far from that one, and we waited for as long as we thought necessary. The big shock to this story, though, was when we caught glimpse of the woman from the train, who we thought was being threatened by the 2 men, walking over in the direction of the men and then calling something along the lines of, "Where are they? Don't tell me you didn't get them." The 2 men reappeared from beyond a corner, walking over to the woman. The rest of what they said was too low to pick up on. They walked back down the stairs to the platforms, and as we could guess, waited for another train to run their trap again. At the very least, we called the police and reported what was going on, but I have no idea if they were ever caught. Number 1. My name is Danny, I'm 22 years old, and this was the most horrifying experience of my life. I live and work in New York City, but I don't have a car, so my main mode of transportation is the subway. It was a Saturday night. I was on my way home from a party in the middle of the night. I did this about every other weekend, so I was completely fine with taking the subway alone at night. Walking down the steps, entering the underground without a soul in sight, it was always a bit chilling. This specific station was very tightly spaced. As I was walking, I could almost feel as if I were being watched or followed, along with the occasional echoing bang type sound emitting from an unknown location. I was early for the train, so I sat on a bench and waited. This is something straight out of a horror movie. I heard this exact phrase. "Psst, over here, buddy." There was somebody standing on the tracks inside the tunnel, poking his head out and looking at me. It was a filthy looking man, I'd say in his early 40s. He gave me a smile, a horrible yellow smile with at least 3 teeth missing, and I could tell that even from where I was sitting. I did the best I could to pay no attention to him, but he wouldn't go away. There was laughing coming from inside the tunnel, and then another disgusting looking man stuck his face out as well. This man gave me a nasty smile as well, before telling me to come hang out with them in the tunnel. The way they stared at me though, their eyes wouldn't even move. It's as if their sight was locked onto me. I resumed doing the best I could to ignore them and just wait for the train. I noticed in my peripheral vision that one of the men moved away into the tunnel, returning moments later with another face. I had to look again. There was a third face, but this one was hunched over and lifeless. It looked like one of the men were holding the guy's face up. The sound of the train approaching felt like 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. I got up ready to board the train, but when I got closer to the edge of the platform, I nearly threw up at the sight. The 2 men were going back into the tunnel, but the second man in the back was holding something in his hand. A head. Just a head. Like a decapitated head. They disappeared from sight onto the side of the tunnel. As the train stopped, I got into the first car, planning on warning the conductor, but no later than after we left the station. I didn't want to be there a second longer. As the train began to move, I saw legs moving down the stairs to the platform, but that was it. I didn't get to see who it was, but what I did get to see, as the train moved into the tunnels, I caught a glimpse of a group of men, hunched up against the railing, inches away from the train window, and they were all looking right at me. I knocked on the conductor's door like a madman, screaming it was an emergency. He opened up and I explained what I just saw. He radioed to somebody in charge of the station, as well as another higher-up of the company, who I'm sure took care of it, or contacted the proper authorities or security, whatever. It seemed to take ages for my stop to come, but when it did, I practically had to hop in my walk from relief. I have since been to one party at the same friend's house, but I skipped that station. I decided it was worth it to take the extra long walk to the next station. I don't know if weird shit happens often in the subway at night. In my experience prior to this incident, it never did. But after this experience, I think I should say you should be extremely cautious when in an isolated place like a subway station late at night.
This happened spring break, about 4 years ago. My girlfriend Anissa wanted to do something low-key. She'd been talking about a cabin trip for months, just somewhere to disappear for a few days with no obligations. Her brother Hunter was on break from school and was staying with us at the time anyway, so he came too. I found a place online. It was pretty deep in the woods, which was the point, and it was cheaper than it had any right to be. I remember thinking that briefly, and then not thinking about it again. We got there Friday night around dinner time. The place felt genuinely cut off. You couldn't see the road you'd driven on from the front porch, which I actually liked at the time. There was an outbuilding off to the side of the property, like a large shed which was padlocked. Hunter played with the lock for a second and said it looked new, like it had been swapped out recently. I said it was probably just the owner keeping equipment in there. We didn't really think much of it. It was getting dark, so we went inside and immediately started making dinner. That first night was fine. We had a few drinks on the porch and went to bed pretty early. I can't remember exactly when, but it started lightly raining at some point. The woods were really loud, which was a major surprise, at least to me. It was this constant wall of insects and frogs, and something about it was actually really calming. I do want to mention that at some point before falling asleep that night, I heard something bigger moving around out there, although I figured it was just a deer. I fell asleep not long after that. What woke me up was a sound like something hitting the side of the cabin. I don't know what time it was exactly, let's just say 2. I froze there in bed for a minute, wondering if what I heard was just part of my dream or not. Right when I was about to try falling back asleep, I heard another thump which sounded identical to the first one. I rolled over to see if Anissa was awake, but she wasn't. So it was up to me to investigate. I really didn't want to, but if there was a bear poking around out there, it would have been better to know about it than to not know. So I reluctantly got out of bed and grabbed one of our flashlights. I didn't want to go outside, but the outdoor visibility through the cabin windows was limited. Despite that, I noticed what appeared to be footsteps on the ground near the outbuilding, which was incredibly alarming. Those footprints could not have been ours because none of us had been outside the cabin after the rain had started, at least not to my knowledge. I reasoned that it was possible Hunter had gone out there without me realizing, so I figured I'd ask him in the morning. Still, I was pretty confident that he wouldn't have done that, which made the situation all the more eerie. The footprints didn't look like an animal's, although they were too far away to tell for sure, and if I had been unwilling to go outside earlier, there was absolutely no chance I was doing so after seeing what I saw. I made sure the place was locked up and went back to sleep. Unfortunately, the night was far from over.
I woke up a few hours later to knocking on the front door, which is one of the most terrifying things I can imagine waking up to. Hearing that knocking meant there was a stranger out there, which actually got my heart going a little bit. It was just so late. I couldn't think of a good reason why someone would be knocking on a cabin door in the middle of nowhere at 4 a.m. The knocking woke up Anissa, who was about 10 times more scared than I was. I had to do something. So I walked over to the door. Before I could even announce myself, the person on the other side said he was a forest ranger and that there'd been some kind of incident in the area and he needed to do a welfare check. I paused a bit before responding, mostly out of fear, but it was obvious he already knew I was there. I told him we were all good and didn't need to be checked up on, saying I just wanted to get back to sleep. I thought that would do the trick, because he paused for a little while before saying anything. But then, instead of leaving, he said he'd need to ask us a few questions. I was instantly suspicious, and I was almost fully confident the person on the other side of the door was not any kind of law enforcement. At that point, Hunter had woken up too and was standing behind me. I whispered to him to call the police, saying I'd stall the guy at the door. I went back and forth with him, giving him nothing answers without telegraphing my suspicion. After a little back and forth, Hunter walked up to me and whispered that the police said no rangers had been dispatched to the area. That's what I suspected, but hearing Hunter actually vocalize it made my heart rate kick up again. I was scared and downright panicking at that point. It was 4 a.m. We were truly in the middle of nowhere, and some guy was banging on the door pretending to be a ranger. I don't know how, but it felt like the person on the porch could sense my fear, because he raised his voice and started banging on the door a little harder. I told the person I wasn't going to open up and I wasn't going to answer any questions, which only seemed to anger him. He started demanding I open the door, threatening to kick it down and telling me I'd be arrested for failure to comply. That's when Anissa screamed at him to go the fuck away, which only made things worse. He started kicking the door, and when it didn't give, he stomped around the cabin. I yelled at Anissa to go lock herself in the bathroom, which she did. Hunter and I grabbed some knives from the kitchen and just kind of tracked the guy's sounds around the cabin. I was beyond terrified, but I had no choice but to prepare for a fight. This guy meant us harm. This guy was trying to break into our cabin and kill us. Before I could react, one of the windows shattered into a million pieces. That guy had thrown a rock through it. I was ready for him to jump through, but he didn't. It was the tensest moment of my life. After what felt like forever, with Hunter and me just staring at a broken window, I heard police sirens approaching. I'll fast forward through this next part. The police searched the area, but miraculously, they couldn't find the guy. Hunter was furious. He was practically yelling at the officers that the freak had been on the property less than a minute before they arrived, so he had to be close by still. The officers said there was nothing they could do, and advised us to just pack up and leave. So that's exactly what we did. It's not like we had much of a choice. But Hunter wouldn't let go of how incompetent those officers were being. It was only after the fear and adrenaline wore off, and we were driving away, that I realized how truly insane what just happened was. For someone to even know about that cabin in the first place was so unlikely. It was like they planned it. And what they even wanted was a mystery in and of itself. All in all, it was an extremely uncomfortable and unsettling experience. This happened back in 2016 when I was a senior in college. I was in a frat, TKE, and one of the traditions that came with being in Greek life, at least at our school, was that you spent spring break with your brothers and whatever sorority or sororities you were affiliated with. The groups were typically huge, usually 30 or 40 people, and everyone packed into the same rental or resort for the whole week. I won't say it was the most wholesome experience you could have in your early 20s, but I also won't pretend I didn't have a ridiculous amount of fun doing it. That particular year, the plan was Acapulco. I don't remember whose idea it was originally, but within a few weeks, we had something like 40 people booked at this resort on the Pacific coast. The main character in this story isn't actually me. It's my buddy Sahil. I'm gonna try putting this as nicely as possible. He was the kind of person who, no matter what situation you put him in, was gonna find a way to make it louder and more complicated than it needed to be. I say that with total affection, because Sahil was genuinely one of the best people I knew in college.
He just had absolutely zero self-preservation instincts and no impulse control, which was especially problematic because he was incredibly impulsive. We were maybe 3 or 4 days into the trip when a group of us decided to go to the local clubs. It was a great time, right up until Sahil, true to form, started scanning the room looking for someone who could get him something. Let's just say, stronger than whatever was in his glass. I'm not going to bother spelling things out, but it shouldn't be too hard to connect the dots here. It was a terrible idea. We were in a foreign country in a city with a reputation that wasn't exactly clean. Plus, nobody in our group spoke any Spanish. I told him to drop it. A couple of the other guys said the same thing, and Sahil said he would. But I knew he wouldn't. I had been through his shit too many times. We kept an eye on him for a while, but the place was genuinely enormous, and after a while, we kind of stopped tracking where he was. He was a grown-ass man. I wasn't about to waste my night babysitting him. I figured he was somewhere in the crowd. Sahil disappearing into a crowd was not unusual. I went about my night with my other friends, and it was a great time. Sahil never turned up though, which I found stranger and stranger the later it got. I don't remember what triggered it, but one second we were all drinking and partying, having a good time, and the next, we were all frantically trying to contact Sahil. He wasn't answering anyone's text messages, and when we called his phone, it went straight to voicemail, meaning it was dead. That wasn't good. Sahil may have been a crazy dude, but he was an organizational freak. He wouldn't just let his phone die like that. After a little while longer, we made the call to leave. Odds were he was back at the resort, and we'd find him passed out in his bed. The sidewalk outside was a mess of people trying to get cabs all at once, so a few of us walked about a block and a half before pulling out phones to call a driver. It was probably around 1 in the morning, so we're just standing there waiting on a driver, when who do we see but Sahil, stumbling towards us out of the darkness. We ran up to him, and it was immediately obvious that something seriously bad happened. He was a complete wreck. His shirt was torn almost fully off, and his face was completely swollen, not to mention the fact that he was limping. We got him into the car and back to the resort. A couple guys kept asking him what happened, and he kept saying he'd explain later. It wasn't until we were back in one of the rooms that he finally started talking. Here's what he told us. He found a guy near the bar. The short Mexican guy who didn't speak much English. He had a friend with him who was supposedly doing the translating. Sahil made it clear what he was looking for, and the guy understood. Sahil told us he was reluctant right away because something felt off about the translator specifically, but he couldn't put his finger on what. Then the short guy pulled out a small sample and offered it to him right there, and Sahil tried it. He said it was good, and that's kind of where his judgment evaporated. After that, the short guy said he couldn't do business inside the club and told Sahil to come outside with him. Sahil knew he shouldn't have gone, but he went anyway, which, I mean, what do you even say to that? They walked out a side exit, and there was a car waiting just outside the door. Before Sahil really understood what was happening, they were already pulling him into the back seat. They drove. He said it felt like maybe 15 or 20 minutes, but he was panicking and not exactly thinking straight, so he honestly wasn't sure. What he was sure about was that they went rummaging through his pockets the second the car started moving. They robbed him, and when he tried to resist, they beat him senseless. They destroyed his phone and stripped him of everything of value. What saved him was that at some point during the drive, one of the guys asked him why there were so many Americans in the city right now, and Sahil, without really thinking about it, explained that he was there on spring break with dozens of other students from the same university who were all staying at the same resort. He had no idea at the time that he was essentially talking his way out of being killed or trafficked. The two guys went back and forth in Spanish for a while after that. Then the car pulled over and they threw him out. He landed on some random road he didn't recognize and just started walking. He didn't know where he was, so he had no choice but to just walk in the direction he thought the car had driven, and by some miracle, it turned out to be the correct decision. I really don't know what would have happened to him had he not run into us, or if he had left the club 20 minutes sooner. We debated calling the police for about 3 seconds before unanimously deciding that was probably the worst idea for everyone involved, Sahil included. Besides the guys in our immediate group, nobody at the resort ever found out what happened. I've been keeping this one bottled up for quite a while now. This happened during spring break of my junior year. I graduated a while ago, so we're going back a few years here. I should mention that I'm kind of a paranoid person. I've just always been naturally observant, skeptical, and cynical. Those honestly aren't the healthiest traits to have. I end up spending a lot of time overthinking and worrying about things that don't matter, but I can't control it. My ex-girlfriend Anna had this friend named Lena. Lena was the type of girl who always knew where the party was and was plugged into every group chat and social circle imaginable, which is why it wasn't surprising in the slightest when she approached Anna with a spring break plan. She said a girl she knew had told her about a lake house trip out in the Ozarks. According to Lena, a bunch of people from that girl's sorority and some of the affiliated frats were renting this big house on the water for the week. Pretty standard, to be completely honest. I wasn't exactly the spring break type, but Anna really wanted to go, and I didn't have a reason not to, so I figured what the hell. There were 4 of us: myself, Anna, Lena, and Lena's boyfriend Colby. Colby opted to drive because he had the biggest car, which was pretty chill of him. It was a long but good drive. Everyone was in a good mood. The final stretch was this long, twisting road that didn't have many houses on it. We pulled up to the house around 5 in the afternoon, and my first thought was that Lena had severely undersold it. The place was massive, right on the lake with this humongous wraparound deck and a dock that went way out over the water. It was the kind of house that makes you wonder who actually owns it. There were also way more cars in the front of the house than I was expecting. Lena had made it sound like there'd only be 15 to 20 people, but I counted at least 25 cars in the grass lot next to the house, with more parked down the road because there wasn't room. That's where Colby had to park. We walked up the front steps to see a guy standing near the front door. He seemed to be about our age, or maybe a little older. He introduced himself, but I don't remember his name, so I'll just call him the host. He seemed friendly enough, but the very first thing I clocked about him was that his speech seemed rehearsed, like he'd had this exact conversation multiple times. And to be fair, he probably had, but it still felt weird to me. You know those safety speeches frat pledges have to give before letting you into a party? It felt kind of like that. He gave us the rundown. He told us where to find our rooms, how to navigate the house, when we could do this or that. Typical house rule stuff like that. Then he brought up the car keys. He said the roads around the lake were narrow and dangerous at night, especially after people had been drinking. He told us it was a liability thing and that they were collecting everyone's keys at the door. He had this whole little speech about it. Colby sort of shrugged it before handing his keys over. The host made a big show about thanking Colby for playing by the rules, which I thought was kind of obnoxious. Then, he opened the door and let us in. I made a mental note of what he was doing with the car keys, and I was pleasantly surprised to see a big bowl of other car keys on the table in the foyer. The host tossed Colby's keys into the bowl and told us to have fun before stepping back outside and closing the door. We went and found our room, which had 2 double beds and a tiny balcony that overlooked the water. We put our stuff away and went back downstairs. Lena was really eager to find her friends, so we followed her. It didn't take long to figure out where the main lounge was. It was this giant open room on the first floor that was lined with full glass windows, so you could get a wraparound view of the water. It was honestly pretty awesome. There must have been at least 30 people hanging out in that one room, but the weird thing was that Lena didn't recognize a single one of them. They all looked like college kids, Greek life people even, but Lena couldn't find her friend or anyone else she knew in the crowd. I wasn't just going to stand there in the corner, so I walked over to the fridge, grabbed a beer for myself and Colby, and made my way over to the pool table, which no one was using. I've never had a hard time connecting with new people, so I didn't really care that we didn't know anyone. Colby didn't seem to care either. We played pool, talked, drank, and just enjoyed the vibe. Our girlfriends came over a little later and told us Lena's friend wasn't answering her phone. They seemed overly concerned about it, but Colby and I told them it was fine. And it was fine. I'm not gonna lie, the first night was actually really fun. Colby and I socialized with a bunch of people who were all really dope. Anna and Lena got along with the girls, and there seemed to be an unlimited supply of alcohol and games. There was one thing that was nagging at me despite all the fun I was having. It was the host. He wasn't really partying, but was always there, walking through the rooms and occasionally talking to people. My first thought was that he was enjoying some slightly bolder substances in some back room with a select few people, but I felt like that was unlikely because I never saw a drink in his hand. At one point, I saw him standing near the back door with a clipboard, like an actual physical clipboard with paper on it, and he was writing something down. Most of the party felt like strangers getting to know each other, which is kind of what I expected, but there were maybe 8 to 10 people who interacted with each other differently. At first, I just thought a big portion of the group already knew each other, but I couldn't help but notice that some of the people who seemed familiar with each other introduced themselves during games and whatnot. As more time passed, I also realized that the 4 of us weren't merging with some bigger group that all knew each other, but rather the whole group was split into a bunch of smaller groups like ours. Besides those 10 or so people, no one knew anyone beyond the people they had pulled up with. I mentioned it to Anna, and she said I was overthinking things, which was probably true. She was also pretty wasted at that point, so I wasn't going to complicate things. Lena's friend never showed up that first night. The next morning, I woke up earlier than everyone else. I went down to the kitchen and made myself a coffee. Then I went out on the deck to sit by myself for a while. I made note of the fact that the bowl with everyone's keys wasn't by the front door anymore, which was a little odd. I wanted to be left alone, so I chose to sit on the side of the house, with the driveway to my left and the water to my right. It was actually really peaceful. Around mid-morning, I noticed a couple I'd seen the night before packing up their stuff. They said goodbye to a few people, and I watched them drive out of sight. Fast forward till later that night, and we're sitting by the bonfire. I was sitting with Anna and a few other people when I happened to glance across the fire toward the far end of the circle. There was a couple sitting together, slightly further back from the group than everyone else. They were positioned with the fire between us, which made it harder to get a clean look. But I kept watching. I realized it was the same guy and girl from earlier, the ones who had left in the morning. I was dead certain of it. I told Anna, and she gave me this confused look. She hadn't seen them leave, so she probably assumed I was misremembering things. There wasn't much I could do to convince her, so instead, I just got up and immediately made my way through the house. I remembered which car was theirs, so I was going to see if it was still gone. I made it to the driveway, and to my surprise, the car wasn't there. Despite that, I was positive the people I had seen were the ones who had left, but by the time I got back to the bonfire, they were gone. I couldn't find them anywhere, and it bugged me for the rest of the night. I didn't bother telling Colby or Lena, and every time I mentioned it to Anna, she told me I was being a psychotic buzzkill. The next morning, I made it a point to wake up really early again. I wanted to go for a walk. I'm not really sure what it was I was looking for, but I needed to convince myself that I wasn't trapped and that there was something outside that house and those people. About a quarter mile down the road, past a bend where you couldn't see anything from the house, there was an equipment shed, some kind of storage building for groundskeeping staff. I walked around it, and my jaw damn near hit the floor. It was the couple's car from the day before. I was sure of it. I just stood there. I don't know how long. I wasn't scared. It was more like confirmation of something I already knew, but I hadn't been able to prove. I turned around and walked back to the house without telling anyone. I was starting to freak out after that. Why would someone pretend to leave? And then I started thinking about those people they had been saying goodbye to, and I wondered if they were in on it as well. I knew what I had to do. That afternoon, I found that couple near the dock. It took me a really long time to find them, and I had to make up some bullshit excuse to tell Anna. I didn't even sugarcoat it. I just bluntly asked them if they had left the morning before. They both gave me a funny look and acted like I was crazy, but I could tell my question struck a nerve. I swear to God, though, it was like everyone around could hear our conversation. There weren't that many people around, but while I was standing there, everyone quieted down a little bit, and I couldn't help but feel like there were eyes on me. Luckily, Anna appeared out of nowhere and told me to have a drink with her. I initially wanted to press that couple, but the way everyone else reacted made me feel deeply uncomfortable in a way that's hard to describe. I told Anna everything, and she actually took me seriously when I brought up the car detail. Then she went on to tell me that she had picked up on some weird stuff herself, like some of the girls having almost identical backstories and stuff like that. I suggested leaving early, but she told me that was probably premature. Either way, the bad feeling I had gotten the first day was getting worse and worse. By the time I woke up the next morning, I made the decision that we were leaving. Anna agreed. Colby and Lena were a different story. Colby straight up laughed at me. He said he wasn't cutting the trip short because I had a theory. Lena admitted it was weird that her friend had basically ghosted her and that she didn't recognize a single person in the house, but she wasn't ready to panic over a parked car. We argued about it for a little, and I was actually stunned by how stubborn they were both being. It's not like Anna and I could have left on our own. We needed Colby's car. We ended up compromising, and the plan was to stay one final night. I was cool with that until we went downstairs for breakfast. Every single set of eyes was on me. I felt it and I didn't like it. It wasn't obvious, and I tried convincing myself I was just having a paranoid freakout, but people were definitely looking at me. A lot of people, which I found incredibly off-putting because most of the people that were looking at me hadn't even been part of the group that had seen me question that couple. I started feeling like something really, really terrible was going to happen if we stayed in that house for even a moment more. Anna felt the eyes too, because she whispered to me that people were looking. I got up from where we were sitting and walked right over to the host, who was standing near the corner of the room. I told him we had to take off and that I needed my keys. He smiled like a fucking robot, then asked if everything was okay. I told him something came up and we needed to head home, to which he actually asked, "What happened?" I hadn't thought of a fake excuse, so I just told him it was a family emergency. He kept diverting the conversation, saying things like some people had planned a boat thing for the evening, and that the nights always get better as the end of the week approaches. He was doing everything he could to get me to stay, all while still smiling at me like a freak. I didn't care. I told him again that I needed the keys. I cannot verbally explain how awful that feeling was. There was a room full of at least 20 people, and every single one of them was staring at me. The host didn't respond, and his Mr. Charming Guy act was gone. He wasn't smiling anymore. He gave this blank, dead-eyed look that creeped me out. Some random girl who was sitting nearby broke the silence by saying, "That's not a good idea." I turned around to look at her, and she was scowling at me. I didn't know what to say. I looked across the room and saw Anna, Lena, and Colby, and they all looked horrified. The host finally said, "Okay, fine," or something like that, and told me to follow him inside. I saw Anna getting up to follow me, but when he saw her move, he put his hand out and said no in a loud, aggressive way that genuinely startled me. It was almost violent. He told me that only I was to follow him, so that's what I did. He led me through a maze of hallways before we reached a room with everyone's keys hanging on hooks. He didn't even ask me which set was mine. He just picked them out because he clearly already knew. I thought he was going to attack me or withhold the keys, but he handed them to me. Then he said, "You're making a mistake." I didn't give a shit. As soon as I had the keys in my hand, I made my way back over to my group. When I got back to that main room, the music was back on and people were laughing and talking again, like nothing had happened. It was freaky. Anna, Colby, and Lena were in the same spot, and I told them we were going. We were packed and out of there in 10 minutes. The entire time, I felt like someone was going to try and stop us, but no one did. As Colby started driving off, I looked back at the house to see the most unsettling thing yet. There were about a dozen people standing on the deck, watching us leave. They were standing in a line, not talking, and it was very obvious they were watching us. I noticed a couple more people looking through the windows, which pretty much confirmed what I had been suspecting all along. There was something up with that f***ing house. For the rest of the break, Lena tried getting in touch with a girl who had supposedly organized the trip. She called and texted and tried every platform she could think of, but got absolutely nothing back. She was starting to think something had actually happened to her. It wasn't until we were back at school that Lena finally tracked the girl down. This is honestly the craziest part of the story. It turned out that her phone had been stolen about 2 weeks before spring break. She had gotten a new number but hadn't told everyone yet. The person who told Lena about the plan wasn't her friend. It was some stranger. Not a single message came from her. We talked about going to the police, but none of us could articulate what crime had actually been committed against us. We went to a party, it was weird, nobody technically did anything. But it was off to the point where I felt like one more night of that would have had some kind of consequence. One that I can't even imagine. This is something I'll never stop thinking about, mostly because it's such a mystery, and the more you think about it, the less it makes sense.